Abigail Miller threw the wedding dress into the fire herself. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just walked to the hearth, dropped every last inch of that ivory fabric into the flames, and watched it burn while her stepmother shrieked behind her. The dress had been chosen for her. The groom had been chosen for her. The entire future had been arranged around her like a cage built from other people's debts. And Abby had finally decided she was done being the lock on somebody else's door. If you've ever felt like the world passed you by, like you were the last choice, the forgotten one, the woman. Everyone looked straight through, then this story was written for you. Stay with me until the very end, because what happens to Abigail Miller is going to remind you of something you may have forgotten about yourself. Subscribe to this channel right now and follow every part of this story. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The autumn of 1887 arrived in Harlan Creek, Montana, with the particular cruelty that only a dying town could produce. The grass had gone the color of old straw. The creek that gave the settlement its name had narrowed to a trickle. 3 families had already packed their wagons and left for Oregon without saying goodbye, and the ones who stayed behind talked about them with a mixture of envy and contempt that told you everything about how desperate things had become. Ethan Carter stood at the window of his private office at Carter Ridge Ranch and looked out across 4,000 acres of the finest grazing land in the entire state of Montana. His cattle numbered in the thousands. His accounts at the Billings Bank held more money than most men in this county would see in 3 lifetimes. His name was known from Helena to Miles City. When Ethan Carter walked into a room, men straightened their backs and women smiled wider than they meant to. And he was so deeply, completely, wretchedly lonely that some mornings he couldn't find a single reason to put his boots on. "You're doing it again," said his ranch foreman Cal Briggs from the doorway. Cal was 61 years old, built like a fence post, and had absolutely no interest in pretending he didn't notice things. Standing there staring at the land like it owes you something. "It doesn't owe me anything," Ethan said without turning around. "No, it don't." Cal crossed his arms. "So what's eating you?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment. He pressed one hand flat against the window glass. "Clara Hutchins sent back the ring," he finally said. Cal didn't say anything for a moment. Then carefully, "When?" "Yesterday morning. Her father delivered it personally. Had the nerve to shake my hand while he did it." Ethan turned from the window. His face was composed in the way that a man's face gets composed when he's been practicing holding things still for too long. "He told me Clara had reconsidered, that she felt the life of a rancher's wife was too demanding for a woman of her sensibilities. That's a generous way of putting it." "It is." Ethan picked up the ring from his desk and looked at it for a moment. It was a good ring. A beautiful ring if he was being honest, because he'd spent considerable time selecting it. He set it back down. "You know what she told me the first night I took her to dinner in Helena? She told me she'd always dreamed of living somewhere with real space, room to breathe, land as far as the eye could see." "And then she saw the land," Cal said. "And then she saw the land. And she started talking about how many guest rooms the main house had, and whether the east parlor could be remodeled, and if I'd considered adding a ballroom." Ethan's voice stayed even. She was already decorating a house she'd never stepped foot in, Cal. She didn't want me. She wanted what came attached to me. She wasn't the first. No, she wasn't. Cal was quiet for a respectful moment. There was the widow Hargrove and the schoolteacher from Bozeman. "I remember them all," Ethan said. "I don't need the list." "Right." Cal pushed off the doorframe and came fully into the room. "So what are you going to do about it?" Ethan looked at the ring one more time. Then he opened the desk drawer, dropped it inside, and closed it. "Something that's probably going to sound insane when I explain it to you." Cal raised his eyebrows and waited. "I want to leave," Ethan said. "Not permanently, not far. But I want to travel as somebody else for a while. A man with nothing. A drifter looking for day work. Somebody women would look straight through instead of straight at." He paused. I want to find out what it feels like when a woman is kind to me because she's just a kind person. Not because she's calculating the square footage of my parlor." Cal stared at him for a long time. "That," he said, "is either the smartest idea I've ever heard or the beginning of a serious mental collapse. Which do you think?" "I genuinely can't tell you yet." Ethan almost smiled. It was the closest he'd come to smiling in several days. "I'll be gone 3 weeks, maybe 4. I'll ride out as Luke Harper. That's a name I used once as a boy, and nobody around here would know it. You run the ranch. You don't tell anyone where I've gone. And if something goes wrong, I'll handle it." Cal looked at him with the particular expression of a man who has worked alongside someone long enough to know that arguing with him is a complete waste of both their time. "All right, boss," he said. "But for what it's worth. The problem ain't that women see your money. The problem is, you keep looking in places where the women are already looking for money. A woman who grew up with nothing doesn't see fortune the same way a woman who grew up hungry for it does." Ethan pulled on a plain canvas work coat, the kind a hired hand might wear, not the kind a ranch owner would. He didn't answer Cal's observation directly, but he remembered it. He remembered it for a very long time. Harlan Creek was 2 days' ride from Carter Ridge, far enough that his face was unknown, and close enough that the countryside felt familiar under his boots. Ethan arrived on a Tuesday morning, his horse unremarkable, his clothing deliberately worn, his saddlebag holding exactly what a man with $30 to his name would carry. He told the man at the livery stable his name was Luke Harper. He said he was looking for ranch workday labor, anything available. The man at the livery pointed him down the road without particular interest, which was exactly the kind of reception Ethan had been hoping for. The town of Harlan Creek was small and past its best days. The main street had a general store, a feed merchant, a saloon that smelled of sawdust and old ambition, and a church whose white paint was beginning to peel at the corners. People moved through it with the particular efficiency of folks who don't have the luxury of dawdling. He ate breakfast in the boarding house, plain eggs, black coffee bread that had been baked the day before, and listened to the conversations happening around him. Small-town talk. Debt and weather. Who was struggling? Who was barely holding on? He heard the name Miller come up twice before he'd finished his first cup of coffee. "Miller Ranch is finished," said a man in a leather vest to the man across from him. "Jacob Miller's been borrowing against the land for 3 years. Blackwood at the bank's got his hooks so deep in that place, there's no pulling them out." "What about the family?" "2 daughters. Margaret's girls, the pretty ones, they'll land somewhere. Women like that always do." A pause. "Then there's the other one. The big one. Abigail." The man's tone shifted into something that sat between dismissal and mild contempt. "Lord only knows what happens to her." Ethan kept his eyes on his coffee cup and said nothing. He found the Miller Ranch that same afternoon following directions given to him at the feed store by a boy of about 12 who seemed relieved to have something useful to do. The ranch sat at the end of a dirt road that needed attention behind a gate that needed repair in front of a house that needed paint. Everything about it communicated the particular exhaustion of a property whose people were working as hard as they could and still losing ground. He rode up to the gate and called out asking if there was any day work available. The woman who came out of the barn was not what he expected. Not because of her size, he'd heard the comments at the boarding house had made his own private accounting of what they meant about the speaker rather than the subject, but because of the way she moved. She had a pitchfork in one hand and a look on her face that said she'd been in the middle of something important and had been pulled out of it, and she assessed him with the quick, practical eyes of someone who'd learned to make accurate judgments fast. "Morning," she said. She didn't smile automatically, which he noticed. Too many people smiled automatically. It meant nothing. "You looking for Jacob Miller?" "I'm looking for work," Ethan said. "Name's Luke Harper. I'm passing through and I'm willing to do whatever needs doing." She looked him over. Not with flattery and not with hostility. Just the calm appraisal of someone evaluating whether a tool was likely to be useful. "My father's in town," she said. "I'm Abigail Miller. I manage the day-to-day." "Miss Miller," he said, and touched the brim of his hat. Something in her expression shifted very slightly at that, as though she hadn't expected the courtesy, as though it surprised her enough to be worth noticing. She covered it quickly. "We've got a section of fence along the north pasture that's been down 3 days," she said. "And the water trough in the east yard needs a new brace, or it's going to split before winter. Can you handle either of those?" "Both," he said. "What's the wage?" She named a number that was fair, but clearly calculated to $1. She wasn't guessing. She knew what money she had and what she could spend. He agreed without negotiating because negotiating would have felt wrong and tied his horse at the post. That was how it began. He worked for 4 days before Jacob Miller returned from town and registered any particular notice of him. Jacob was a tall man, running to softness with the distracted, slightly hunted look of someone who'd been managing bad news for so long it had become his permanent expression. He shook Ethan's hand, Luke's hand, without much interest, and told him there was a bunk in the small building behind the barn if he needed it. The stepmother Margaret barely acknowledged his existence. She was a handsome woman in a cold architectural way, the kind of handsome that has been carefully maintained and considers itself an achievement. She appeared at meals to direct them at morning, to issue instructions to the household, and at intervals to deliver commentary on the shortcomings of everything around her. She spoke to Ethan with the efficient neutrality she reserved for tools and furniture. She spoke to Abby in a different register entirely. "Abigail, that bread is overdone again. If you can't manage a simple loaf without ruining it..." "It's fine, Mama." "Don't call me that. I've told you." "I'm sorry, Margaret, it's fine. The bottom got a bit dark, but the inside is..." "The inside doesn't matter if no one wants to cut into it. Your sisters manage bread without incident. I don't understand why it's so difficult for you." Ethan was at the table eating breakfast when this exchange happened 3 days into his time at the Miller Ranch. He kept his eyes on his plate. He kept his expression arranged in the careful blankness of a hired hand who knows better than to involve himself in family business. But he heard it, and he catalogued it. He catalogued the way Margaret's younger daughters Cecilia and Josephine, 17 and 19, genuinely lovely in a conventional way, and fully aware of it, spoke about Abby as though she were a fixture of the house rather than a person in it. They talked around her through her past, her the way people talk around furniture they've stopped seeing. "Is there any more jam?" Cecilia asked the table, generally not looking at Abby, who was standing at the kitchen counter. "There's a jar on the second shelf," Abby said. Cecilia turned to Josephine. "Would you get the jam?" Josephine got up and went to the second shelf. She passed within 2 feet of Abby without acknowledgement. Ethan took a slow drink of his coffee. He catalogued the way the townspeople treated Abby on the 2 occasions he accompanied the household to Harlan Creek for supplies. The way women found reasons to turn their backs when she approached. The way men either ignored her or produced a particular kind of smile, half amusement, half discomfort, that was somehow worse than outright dismissal. He watched a woman in a blue bonnet whisper something to the woman beside her, as Abby passed both of them, glancing after her with expressions of combined pity and condescension that made Ethan's jaw tighten. He didn't intervene, not then. He was supposed to be observing, but he found himself on the walk back to the wagon positioning himself somewhat closer to Abby than strict necessity required, walking on the side of the boardwalk that put him between her and the whispers. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself it was automatic. He watched the back of her head and the set of her shoulders, straight, deliberate, giving nothing to the watchers, and thought that whatever she was carrying, she'd been carrying it a long time. It was on the 6th evening that he first saw what she did when she thought no one was watching. He'd gone to the barn late to check on his horse, a genuine concern the animal had seemed slightly off his feed, and in the dim light from a lantern set on a post, he found Abby seated on an overturned crate with a dog in her lap. Not a small dog, a large elderly hound with gray around his muzzle, who was clearly in some kind of discomfort, and Abby had her hands moving slowly through his fur, her voice low and continuous, talking to the animal the way people talk when they're certain no one else is listening. "It's all right," she was saying. "It's all right, old man. I know it hurts. I know it does. Just breathe. Just breathe and let it pass." Ethan stopped in the shadow of the barn door. The dog's tail moved once, a slow, effortful wag, the kind that costs something. Abby made a small sound, something between a laugh and a sigh, and bent her forehead down to rest briefly against the dog's head. "There you go," she murmured. "See, you're still here. You're still exactly here." Ethan stood in the shadow and felt something shift in his chest. It was a quiet shift, the kind that doesn't announce itself. He backed out of the barn without making a sound. On the 8th day, he was repairing the gate latch when he heard voices on the road. He looked up to see 3 men from town riding past ranch hands from one of the other spreads. By the look of them, men in their 20s, with that particular swagger that comes from having had a good day and an uncomplicated life. Abby was in the yard carrying a bucket of water for the garden. One of the men looked over the fence and grinned. "Hey there, Miss Miller," he called out. "Still hauling water? Shouldn't you get a cart for that? A girl of your substantial qualities ought to spare herself the exertion." His companions laughed. Not cruel laughter, exactly the kind of laughter that doesn't know it's cruel, which is somehow worse. Abby kept walking. She didn't break stride, didn't look up, didn't change her expression. She carried the bucket to the garden and set it down with the precise, unhurried movements of a woman who has long since decided that reaction is a luxury she can't afford. Ethan had stood up from the gate. He'd turned. He'd taken 2 steps toward the road before he caught himself and stopped. The men were already riding on. He stood there for a moment, his hands not quite relaxed at his sides, watching them go. Then he looked at Abby. She was on her knees in the garden now, checking the plants with the same focused attention she gave to everything, her face composed and private. She looked up and found him watching her. A brief, assessing look, the kind she'd given him that first day. "Latch fixed?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment longer than a hired hand probably should have. Then, "Almost," he said. "Be done by noon." She nodded and went back to the garden. Yeah, it was the conversation on the 4th night after that which he thought about later as the moment things changed direction in a way that couldn't be undone. He'd been sitting outside the bunkhouse in the cooling evening, whittling a habit from boyhood he returned to, when his mind was working through something, when Abby came out of the main house and crossed the yard toward the barn with an armful of blankets. He watched her go in. After a few minutes, he followed. "You putting blankets on the horse?" he asked from the doorway. "The old mare. She gets cold at night now." She was settling a blanket over a small, sway-backed horse in the far stall. "She's too old to sell and too valuable to put down so." "So you take care of her?" "Somebody has to." He came further into the barn and leaned against the stall rail. "Why do you do it?" he asked, not challenging, genuinely curious. She smoothed the blanket and looked up at him. "What do you mean?" "All of it," he said. "The cooking and the cleaning and the fence and the water and the garden and the animals. You do more work than anyone on this property, and I've never once heard anyone thank you for it." She was quiet for a moment. The mare shifted gently under her hands. "Someone has to do it," she said again. "That's not an answer." Something in her face changed. Not defensiveness. It was too tired for defensiveness. More like the expression of someone who's been asked a question they'd decided long ago not to ask themselves. "What would you like me to say, Mr. Harper?" "I'd like you to say what's actually true," he said. "If you want to." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she sat down on the edge of the hay bale nearest the mare's stall and folded her hands in her lap and seemed to make some private decision. "I do it because if I don't, it doesn't get done," she said. "I do it because this ranch is my father's life's work, and I can't watch it fall apart just because everyone else has decided to stop caring whether it does. And I do it because—" She stopped. Started again. "Because I've spent my whole life being told that I'm not particularly wanted anywhere. And if that's going to be true, regardless of what I do, then I'd rather be unwanted and useful than unwanted and useless." The barn was very quiet. "Who told you that?" Ethan said. "Told me what?" "That you weren't wanted." She made a sound that was nearly a laugh. Nobody had to tell me, Mr. Harper. It's just something you know after a while. You see how people look at you, or how they don't. You notice what happens when you walk into a room who stops talking and who starts whispering. You pay attention, and eventually the picture's pretty clear. She paused. I don't say it to be sorrowful. It's just true. Ethan looked at her. He was quiet for long enough that she glanced up at him with a slight question in her eyes. I don't think it's true, he said. Mr. Harper, I've been here almost 2 weeks, he said, and I've watched you. You are the most capable person on this property. You are the most honest. You are the first one up and the last one down. When that dog was sick, you sat with him for 3 hours. When the minister's wife came by last Thursday in that rattling old wagon, you sent her away with half the bread you'd just baked, and you waved off her thanks like it was nothing. He kept his voice even conversational, the same tone he'd used to tell her the gate was fixed. Now, I don't know what mirror this town has been holding up for you, Miss Miller, but I think the reflection they've been showing you is wrong. She stared at him. Then she looked away. You're kind to say so, she said. Her voice was careful. But you haven't been here long enough to know how it really is. Maybe, he said. Or maybe I came from somewhere else and I'm seeing it clearly for the first time. He didn't push it further. He touched the brim of his hat and went back to the bunkhouse. But he lay awake for a long time that night, looking at the ceiling, thinking about the way she'd said, I'd rather be unwanted and useful than unwanted and useless, with that calm, practical acceptance, as though it were simply a fact about the weather. He thought about it for a long time. The trouble arrived on a Tuesday morning with the particular timing that serious trouble tends to have, the moment when everything seems briefly like it might be managing. He had been at the Miller Ranch for 17 days. In that time he had repaired the gate, the water trough 2 sections of fence, the barn door that had been sticking on its hinge, the pump mechanism in the east yard, and 3 pieces of tack that had been quietly deteriorating in the corner of the barn. He had begun to understand the property as intimately as if he'd worked it for years. He had also begun to understand its people in ways that made him progressively angrier on behalf of one of them. He was in the east yard when the wagon came up the road. 2 men on the seat, one of them a barrel-shaped figure in a good coat that communicated wealth without elegance. The other a younger man who had the look of a person paid to be present rather than to think. Ethan kept working. He listened. Jacob Miller came out of the house with the walk of a man approaching something he's already lost. Harold, he said, wasn't expecting you today. Business doesn't wait on expectations, Jacob. The barrel-shaped man, Harold Blackwood Ethan would later confirm, stepped down from the wagon with the settled authority of a man who has been right about money so many times, he's stopped distinguishing between being right and being righteous. I thought it best we talk directly. I've been patient, but the notes are overdue. I know they are. You've been working on it for 8 months, Blackwood said. I have been extremely generous with your situation, Jacob. But the fact of it is plain. You cannot pay what you owe. The land will have to come to me. Jacob Miller aged 5 years in 10 seconds. Harold, this ranch has been in my family. I understand that, and I'm prepared to offer you an alternative. Blackwood's voice dropped into the particular register of a man who is about to be generous in a way that benefits only himself. A business arrangement that would settle your debts completely and allow you to remain on the property. What kind of arrangement? Blackwood smiled. Your daughter Abigail. I've been without a wife for 3 years now. She's of sound mind and good health, and I have no particular requirement for beauty in a domestic arrangement. She would keep the house. I would settle the debt. The ranch stays in the Miller name. He spread his hands as though presenting something obvious. Everyone benefits. Ethan's hands had gone still on the pump mechanism. That's... Jacob stopped. Started. She's only 29. An appropriate age, Blackwood said. I'm a reasonable man, Jacob. I'm not unreasonable in my domestic expectations. She would be housed and kept. Your family would be solvent. He tilted his head. What exactly is the alternative you're weighing this against? Jacob Miller looked at the house. He looked at his hands. He looked at Harold Blackwood and Ethan Carter. 17 days into the best performance of his life, put down the tool in his hand very slowly and carefully so that the setting down of it made no sound at all. "I'll need to speak to Margaret," Jacob said. "Of course," said Blackwood. "I'll call again on Friday." Yun. They told Abby at dinner that evening. Ethan was not in the dining room. Hired hands ate in the bunkhouse or the kitchen, not at the family table. But the ranch house was not large, and the walls were not thick, and he sat in the kitchen with his coffee going cold in his hand and heard every word. "Blackwood has made an offer," Margaret said. Her voice was the voice she used for efficiency, clipped and clear. "He's prepared to settle all outstanding debts in exchange for a formal arrangement." "What sort of arrangement?" That was Cecilia. "A marriage arrangement." A pause. "With Abigail." Silence. Then Abby's voice, very quiet and very even. "I beg your pardon." "It's a practical solution," Jacob said. His voice had the quality of a man reading from a paper he didn't write. "The debts are significant, Abby. We've been over the numbers, and there's no other—" "You're telling me," Abby said still in that quiet, even voice, "that you've agreed to marry me to Harold Blackwood." "We haven't agreed to anything yet. We're presenting the— Yet. Harold Blackwood is 62 years old, Papa. He's buried 2 wives. Her voice was still level. Ethan heard it and felt the levelness of it like something physical. "And you're sitting there telling me this is a practical solution." "It would save the ranch," Margaret said. "It would save you," Abby said. And something in her voice changed. Just slightly. Just enough. "I'm not the ranch, Margaret." "No one is suggesting you are. You're suggesting I should be sold to settle a debt. That's what you're suggesting." "Abigail, you're being dramatic." "Am I?" Her chair scraped back. "Has anyone in this room asked me what I want? Has anyone at this table—" A pause. A breath. "Don't bother answering. I know the answer." Ethan heard footsteps crossing the dining room. He heard the door to the back of the house open. He sat still for exactly 10 seconds. Then he got up. He found her in the barn. She was standing with her back to the door, her hands gripping the rail of the old mare's stall, her shoulders carrying something that looked very heavy. She heard him come in and didn't turn. "Miss Miller," he said. "Please don't," she said. Her voice was tight in a way he hadn't heard before, the tightness of someone holding something back through sheer will. "I heard," he said simply. A long silence. "Of course you did." She let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh. "So now you know. My family's going to sell me to an old man to pay their bills." Her hands tightened on the rail. And nobody argued. Nobody said one word in that room that sounded like it came from someone who— She stopped. "It doesn't matter." "It matters," Ethan said. She turned then. Her eyes were dry. She hadn't been crying, or if she had, she'd put it away already, but her face was open in a way he'd never seen it before. The composed, competent private face she wore like armor through every day on this ranch had come loose at the edges, and what was underneath it was something rawer and more honest than anything she'd shown him before. "What do you want me to do with that, Mr. Harper?" she said. "It matters. All right. It matters. And then what?" "Then I tell you something," he said. "And you can do whatever you want with it after." She waited. He took a breath. He'd been turning this moment over in his mind since Tuesday morning, since Blackwood's wagon came up the road. He'd been calculating it, preparing it, deciding when. Now that it was here, all the preparation felt insufficient. "My name isn't Luke Harper," he said. The look on her face changed. Subtle, but unmistakable. "My name is Ethan Carter," he said. "I own Carter Ridge Ranch, 4,000 acres 12 miles north of Helena. I've been here on my own ranch for 15 years. My name is known in Helena, Billings, and Miles City. And I am standing in your barn as a man who has lied to you about who he is since the day he arrived, and I owe you an honest explanation for that." She stared at him. He told her. He told her all of it. Clara Hutchins. The ring returned Cal's observation about looking in the wrong places. He told her about arriving in Harlan Creek with $30 and a common man's coat. He told her about sitting in the boarding house and hearing men dismiss her by name before he'd ever set eyes on her. He told her about the gate and the trough and the fence and 17 days of watching the most capable and the most discarded person on this property go about her work with a quiet grace that made the world she was doing it in look mean by comparison. He said all of it without decoration. Straight through the way you tell the truth when you've been holding it for long enough that the holding has gotten heavier than the telling. When he finished, she was very still. "So," she said, finally, carefully. "You're rich." "Yes." "And you've been watching me." "Yes. And now you're telling me this? Because why?" "Because you feel guilty. Because you want to help. Because you feel sorry for me." Her voice didn't rise. It stayed level, but it had an edge in it now, a clean, sharp edge. "Because if the answer is any of those things, Mr. Carter, I'd like you to know that I have had enough pity from this county to last 3 lifetimes, and I don't want any more of it. Not even from you." "That's not why," he said. "Then what?" He looked at her, this woman who had been sold and dismissed and overlooked, and laughed at who had watched the road from that house every day with the patience of someone who had learned not to expect a rival, who had fed strangers and comforted animals, and kept a failing ranch on its feet through the sheer stubborn insistence that something worth saving deserved to be saved. And he said, the only true thing he had. "Because I wanted you to know," he said, "that you have a choice. Not rescue, not charity, not a solution to someone else's problem. A genuine choice. You can say no to Blackwood. You can say no to all of it. And if you want to walk off this property tonight and figure out what you actually want your life to look like, I will ride beside you. Not as your answer, just as someone who thinks you deserve the chance to find one." The barn was very quiet. "What do you want?" he said. "Not what your family wants, not what the town thinks, not what's practical. What do you, Abigail Miller, actually want?" She looked at him for a long moment. The lantern light moved slightly. The old mare shifted in her stall. "I want," Abby said slowly, like a woman hearing her own voice say something for the first time, "to not be a solution anymore." "All right," Ethan said. "I want to go somewhere where nobody knows the shape of me before they know the substance of me." "All right." "I want—" She stopped. Her voice had developed a slight unevenness, the first crack in it he'd heard all night. "I want somebody to ask me what I want and actually mean it." "I'm asking," he said. "And I mean it." She looked at him for one more long moment. Then she reached past him and unhooked her coat from the post by the barn door. She pulled it on with the deliberate, unhurried movements he'd come to recognize as entirely hers. She picked up her hat. "Then let's go," she said, "before I lose my nerve." They rode out of the Miller Ranch in the dark, under a Montana sky that had gone the deep cold blue of late autumn nights, the kind of sky that makes the stars look close enough to be significant. He didn't tell her what came next. She didn't ask. They rode north through the dark and the cold, and the particular wide-open silence of Montana at night, with everything behind them and whatever came next still a distance away. And Abigail Miller, who had spent 29 years being the woman no one chose, rode toward the horizon and breathed. The stars were still out when they crossed the first ridge north of Harlan Creek, and Abby didn't look back. That surprised him a little. He'd half expected her to turn in the saddle to take one last look at the only home she'd ever known. But she kept her face forward, her back straight, her eyes on the dark line of the horizon, the way a woman keeps her eyes on something she's decided she needs. He rode beside her and didn't fill the silence, because the silence felt like something she was using, something she needed to move through at her own pace. And the least he could do was let her have it. They rode for nearly an hour before she spoke. "Tell me about your ranch," she said. Not with eagerness, not the calculating eagerness he'd heard in too many other voices over too many other years. Just the voice of someone who needs something to think about that isn't what they just left behind. "It's big," he said. Then, recognizing that was insufficient, "Bigger than I need, probably. I've got a main house with more rooms than I've ever had occasion to use, good grazing land, good water. About 60 head of staff between the house and the fields." 60, she said, give or take. She was quiet for a moment. "And none of them know you were gone?" "Cal knows. He's my foreman. He's known me 20 years, and he thinks I've lost my mind." "Has he met you?" "Extensively. Then he's probably right." It startled a real laugh out of him. The first genuine laugh he'd produced in, he couldn't actually remember how long. It felt strange in his chest, like a door opening in a room that had been closed for a season. She didn't laugh with him, but the corner of her mouth moved, just slightly. They rode on through the dark Montana night, and the cold had real teeth in it. The kind of cold that makes the world feel very clear and very honest. After a while, she pulled her coat tighter and asked without particular drama, "What happens when we get there?" "That's up to you." "Don't do that," she said. "Do what?" "Put everything on me. I've spent my whole life being told every inconvenient thing is my responsibility. I don't need that from you, too." Her voice was flat, not unkind, just clear, the way she said most things. "I'm asking you what you have in mind. I'm allowed to ask that." He considered it seriously. "I have in mind that you need a safe place to stand while you figure out what comes next. My ranch can be that. You'd have your own quarters. No obligations, no arrangements." He said the last word with a particular flatness that communicated exactly what he thought of the arrangement Harold Blackwood had offered. "My housekeeper Rosa runs the domestic side of the main house. She'll see to anything you need. Nobody on my property will treat you the way—" He stopped himself. "The way my family does," Abby finished quietly. Not with bitterness, just with the blunt precision of someone naming a fact. "Yes," he said. She was quiet for a long stretch of road after that, long enough that he wondered if he'd said something wrong. But when she spoke again, her voice was steady. "I need you to understand something," she said. "I am not a charity case. I'm not a project. I'm not something someone rescues and then puts on a shelf and feels good about." She looked over at him in the dark. He could see her profile against the sky, clean and serious. "I will work for my keep. Whatever needs doing. I don't know your operation yet, but I learn fast and I work hard, and I expect to be treated like someone who's earning her place, not someone who's been given one." "I know that," he said. "I mean it, Ethan." It was the first time she'd used his name, his real name. The sound of it in her voice, direct and unornamented, hit him somewhere in the sternum in a way he hadn't anticipated. "I know you mean it," he said, "and I'm telling you, I'm counting on it." Yet, they arrived at Carter Ridge Ranch in the gray pre-dawn hours, when the world was that peculiar shade of dark blue that comes just before the sky commits to morning. Cal Briggs was already up. Cal was always already up, and he came out of the main barn with a lantern in his hand, and the expression of a man who has been waiting on news he wasn't sure would be good. He looked at Ethan. He looked at Abby. He looked back at Ethan with an expression that communicated a considerable number of things without a single word. "Miss Abigail Miller." Ethan said, "This is Cal Briggs. He runs this operation better than I do, and he knows it." Cal touched his hat. "Miss Miller," he said with the same plain courtesy he gave everyone. "You look like you've had a long night." "I've had a long life," she said. The night was just the end of it. Cal's eyebrows went up almost imperceptibly. He looked at her for 1 second longer than necessary. Then he looked at Ethan, and something passed between the two men, something that had the shape of, "You may have done something right," and Cal turned back toward the barn. "I'll have somebody show you to the south rooms," he said over his shoulder. "Rosa's up by 5. She'll get you settled." "I don't need settling," Abby said. "Is there something that needs doing this morning? Something useful?" Cal stopped walking. He turned around slowly. "Ma'am." "I'd rather have work than a room," she said. "The room can wait." Cal looked at Ethan again. Ethan said nothing because this was going exactly as he'd somehow suspected it might. "The feed needs distributing in the east paddock," Cal said carefully. "We're a hand short this morning. Bill's got a bad knee." "Show me where the feed is," Abby said. Cal showed her where the feed was. By the time the sun was fully up, most of the hands who worked the east paddock had formed quiet individual opinions about the new woman at Carter Ridge Ranch, and none of those opinions matched what they'd expected to have when they came to work that morning. She was capable in a way that communicated itself immediately and without effort, the way she lifted and distributed, the way she moved among the animals, without nervousness, the way she paid attention to which ones were off and adjusted without being told. Hector, who had worked with cattle for 30 years and had the corresponding degree of patience for people who didn't know what they were doing, had told her twice that she was doing it right, which was more approval than he extended to most new hands in their first month. She'd registered each piece of information she was given and applied it exactly once, never requiring a second instruction. And when the morning's work was done and the hands gathered at the pump to wash up before breakfast, there was a man named Tucker Young, quick-mouthed, the kind of young man whose humor ran ahead of his judgment, who looked at Abby and started to form the kind of comment that he'd spent his life forming about women who looked like her. He got halfway through the first word. Hector looked at him. Just looked at him. Tucker closed his mouth. It was, Cal later told Ethan with some satisfaction, one of the more efficient corrections he'd witnessed in 30 years of ranch management. Ethan did not hover. This was a deliberate decision, and one that required more discipline than most decisions he made in a given day. He went about his work, and there was considerable work waiting for him after nearly 3 weeks away. And he trusted Rosa to see to the domestic side of things. Trusted Cal to manage the field operations, and deliberately did not check on Abby every 40 minutes, the way every instinct he had was suggesting he should. What he did instead was pay attention to what he heard. And what he heard over the first few days was a series of small data points that assembled themselves into something that felt significant. Rosa telling him with her particular blend of efficiency and warmth that Miss Miller had reorganized the pantry inventory in a way that would save them 2 trips to town each month. Hector telling Cal that the new woman had spotted a fence issue in the northwest section that had been building for 2 seasons without anyone catching it. 2 of the younger children who belonged to a family of seasonal workers and who spent their days underfoot when school wasn't in session, following Abby around the yard, with the devoted attention of small animals who have identified a reliable source of warmth. He didn't say anything about any of it. But on the 4th evening, he found her in the kitchen with Rosa, the 2 of them seated at the work table, with the ranch's supply ledgers spread between them, deep in a conversation that had clearly been going on for some time. "You're over-ordering the flour by nearly 1/3, Abby was saying. "And the salt. I know it feels like insurance, but it's sitting in storage until it's no good, and then you're replacing it. If you order to a tighter schedule, you can redirect that money to the beef tallow account, which..." She looked up and saw him in the doorway. A very brief recalibration. "I'm not overstepping," she said immediately. "I didn't say you were." "You looked like you were about to." "I was about to say come to dinner when you have a moment." Rosa, who was 63 years old and had seen a great deal, looked from Abby to Ethan and back again with an expression that was entirely too composed to be accidental. "I'll finish this tomorrow," Abby told Rosa. "Of course," Rosa said with the serene neutrality of a woman who has already made up her mind about a situation. They ate together that evening, just the 2 of them at the smaller table in the kitchen, rather than the formal dining room, because neither of them had suggested the formal dining room, and both of them seemed to find the kitchen preferable without discussing it. "Tell me something," he said. She looked up from her plate. "All right. What are you going to do with your life, I mean? Now that you're not, now that things have changed." He tried again. "What do you actually want it to look like?" She set her fork down. She thought about it with the same serious attention she gave to everything, the kind of thinking that doesn't perform itself. I want to run something, she said finally. I don't know exactly what, but I've been managing a failing operation for 3 years, and I know what I'm doing. I know supply and inventory and animal management and people management and the kind of small decisions that keep a place solvent versus the kind that sink it. I want to do that work somewhere that the work matters, where it adds up to something. She paused. I know that it sounds like exactly the kind of person I've been trying to hire for 2 years, he said. She looked at him. I mean that seriously, he said. Cal is the best field foreman I've ever had, but the administrative side of this operation is a disaster. I've got 3 different people doing overlapping jobs, supply costs running 20% higher than they should, because nobody's consolidated the ordering and record-keeping that would make an accountant weep. He watched her face. If you were interested. If I were interested, she repeated carefully. As a position, a real one, with a wage, not as a gesture, not as something I'm inventing to give you something to do. She was quiet for long enough that he began to calculate whether he'd pushed wrong. Why? She said. Not suspicious. Just direct. Because I think you're exceptionally good at it. And because it would benefit the ranch. And... He stopped. Decided to say the honest thing. And because you told me you wanted to be somewhere the work adds up to something. And I happen to have a place where it would. She looked at him for a long moment across the kitchen table, in the plain lamplight, with the sound of the Montana evening around them, and the ledgers still spread out in the other room, and everything both of them weren't saying, filling up the quiet space between the sentences. I'd want a real wage, she said, not charity dressed up as a salary. Fair market rate, he said, plus room and board. I'd want actual authority, not a title. Cal will confirm every decision I give you is real. And I'd want... She hesitated, just barely. I'd want it understood that this is a professional arrangement, that it doesn't... She seemed to search for the word. I understand what you're saying, he said, and he kept his voice entirely steady, the way you keep your voice when something costs you something to say. And I agree, completely. Whatever else this is or isn't, that part is yours to define. Something in her shoulders came down a fraction. Not relief exactly, but something adjacent to it. All right, she said. Then yes. The first letter came from Margaret Miller on the 9th day. Ethan knew it had come because Rosa brought it to him with a particular expression, the expression Rosa used for things she felt required his personal attention and his better judgment simultaneously. He took it, read it, and set it on his desk without immediate reaction. It was not a letter of concern. It was not an inquiry into Abby's welfare. It was, in essence, a demand dressed in the clothing of a request, a reminder that Abigail had obligations to her family, and that her departure had created significant difficulties, and that Harold Blackwood had renewed his proposal and was awaiting a response, and that surely Abigail understood the position she was placing her family in. Margaret had not asked if Abby was all right. She had not expressed relief that Abby was safe. She had not, in 12 lines of carefully composed script, managed to write her stepdaughter's name with anything that resembled tenderness. He carried the letter to Abby's office. She'd been using the small room off the main corridor for the past week, and it had already been transformed from a storage space into something that looked functional and inhabited papers in organized stacks. The supply ledgers annotated and corrected, and set it on the desk in front of her without preamble. She read it. He watched her face as she did. He was getting better at reading what she let through versus what she held back, which was its own kind of intimacy, the kind that builds between people who are paying genuine attention to each other. Her face went very still, in a way that was different from her usual composure, more brittle, less chosen. She set the letter down. You don't have to respond to that, he said. I know. She smoothed the letter flat with one hand, then seemed to realize what she was doing and pulled her hand back. She didn't ask if I was safe. No. She didn't ask if I was eating, or where I was sleeping, or... She stopped. She asked about Blackwood's proposal. Yes. He's 62 years old, Abby said very quietly. He's buried 2 wives, and they were going to give me to him to settle a livestock debt. The word livestock sat in the room like a stone dropped in still water. "Abby, I'm not upset," she said. "I mean, I am, but it's not new. This is just the newest form of something that's been true my whole life." She looked up at him. Her eyes were dry, and her voice was steady, but something behind her eyes was doing something complicated. "Do you know what the worst part is? It's not even the cruelty of it. It's that they genuinely don't think they're being cruel. They think they're being practical. They think I should be grateful that someone wants me at all." Ethan didn't say anything for a moment. Then carefully, "What do you want to say back to her?" "Nothing," Abby said. "I want to say absolutely nothing, and I want that silence to be the loudest thing she's ever heard." He nodded slowly. "Then that's what we'll do." She looked at him. "We." "You're not handling this alone," he said. "Not anymore." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back down at the letter. She folded it. She placed it in the bottom drawer of the desk. She closed the drawer. Then she opened the supply ledger and went back to work. What he hadn't anticipated, what he should have perhaps, but hadn't, was the speed at which things traveled through the county. He'd been back at Carter Ridge for 11 days, when word began to reach him through the informal network that constituted the real communication system of rural Montana, a word from a trader, a comment from the feed merchant's wife relayed through Rosa, an observation from a hand who'd been to Harlan Creek over the weekend. People were talking. Most of it was predictable. The Miller girl had run off. She'd been taken in by the Carter Ranch. There was speculation about the nature of the arrangement that ranged from the sympathetic to the salacious, with a wide swath of plain curiosity in between. What was less predictable was the visit from James Whitfield. Whitfield was a county commissioner. A wiry, silver-haired man of about 50, with an honest face and a reputation for being the kind of county official who actually did the job rather than using it as a platform for something else. He arrived on a Wednesday afternoon and asked to see Ethan directly. "I'll be plain with you," Whitfield said when they were seated in the front room. "I've had Harold Blackwood in my office twice this week. He's claiming the Miller girl was, and I'm quoting him here, induced to leave the family property. He's making noises about legal action." Ethan looked at him steadily. "On what basis?" "He's claiming the arrangement her family had made on her behalf constitutes a binding agreement that she's now in breach of." "What arrangement?" Ethan said, keeping his voice entirely level. "There was no signed contract. Blackwood made a proposal to the father. The daughter was informed of it after the fact and never consented to it." Whitfield looked at him. "You know that for certain?" "I was present," Ethan said. "As a ranch hand working the Miller property at the time, I heard the conversation at the dinner table." He paused. "I also heard Miss Miller's response, which was a direct refusal." Whitfield was quiet for a moment. "You're aware that Blackwood has some influence with the circuit judge?" "I'm aware of that," Ethan said. "I'm also aware that Blackwood selling his influence to a judge is exactly the kind of thing that becomes very interesting reading in the Helena newspaper, particularly if someone were to share the details of the arrangement he proposed to the Miller family, trading their daughter's freedom for debt cancellation." Whitfield looked at him for a long moment. "That's not public yet." "It will be," Ethan said quietly, "if it needs to be." The commissioner picked up his hat. He turned it in his hands for a moment. "I'm not Blackwood's man," he said finally. "I want you to know that. I came here to tell you what he's doing, not to threaten you with it." He stood. "He's going to keep pushing. He's a man who doesn't accept a no when he's decided he wants something. Most men like that eventually encounter a door that doesn't open," Ethan said. "This one won't." After Whitfield left, Ethan sat alone for a few minutes. Then he went to find Cal. "I need you to contact Harlan Dowse," he told Cal. "Dowse was the best property lawyer in Helena. Tell him I need a consultation this week if possible. Tell him it involves a contract dispute and potential interference in a woman's rights of personal determination." Cal wrote it down without comment. Then, without looking up, he said, "She know Blackwood's pushing. Not yet. She's going to want to know. I know. She's going to be angry you didn't tell her immediately. I know that too. Cal looked up. So why are you telling me first? Ethan thought about it. Because I needed 60 seconds to be angry myself before I go be rational with her. He took a breath. Where is she? Supply room, Cal said. She reorganized the entire East storage this morning. Hector says she found 3 crates of equipment we've been reordering for 2 years. Ethan started for the door. Boss, Cal said. He stopped. She's going to be fine, Cal said. She's made of something specific, that one. You can see it. I know, Ethan said. That's why Blackwood's going to fail. He told her that same afternoon. He laid it out plainly. Whitfield's visit. Blackwood's claims, the legal noise he was making, and watched her face as she processed it. She was very still in the way she got still when something mattered. He's claiming I'm in breach, she said. Of an agreement you never made, Ethan said. You never signed anything. You never consented to anything. The law is on your side. The law and Blackwood are frequently in the same room, she said. Not in my county, he said. She looked at him. This is your county. Yes, it is. He kept his voice even. And I have a lawyer in Helena who is going to confirm in writing that Harold Blackwood's claim has no legal standing. And I have a relationship with the Helena paper whose editor I've known for 8 years. And I have enough history with the men in this county that when I say Blackwood is attempting to coerce a woman into a marriage arrangement, she refused, I will be believed. You'd do all of that, she said. In about 20 minutes, yes. Why? He looked at her. The question sat there between them, honest and direct and deserving of the same in return. Because what he's doing is wrong, he said. Because you said no, and that should have been the end of it. And because... He paused, just briefly. Because you're not handling this alone anymore. I told you that. I meant it. She held his gaze for a long moment. Something moved through her expression, not sentimentality, nothing so soft as that. Something more like a woman recognizing solid ground after a long time on uncertain terrain, and choosing carefully and deliberately to stand on it. All right, she said. Tell me exactly what Dowes will need from me. He'll need your account of the evening, your direct refusal, any witnesses. You were a witness. I was. Under your real name. Under my real name, he confirmed. She was quiet for a moment. Then, that's going to raise questions. Why Ethan Carter was working as a day laborer on the Miller Ranch? Yes. Questions that will require explanations. Yes. She looked at him with that clear, direct assessment she'd given him the very first day, the one that saw past the surface without being unkind about what it found. You're prepared for people to know why. If it protects you, he said, I am completely prepared to explain myself to every person in Montana. Something in her expression shifted, very quietly. Not toward romance, she was not a woman who went quietly toward romance, but toward something that had the same essential quality as trust. The particular trust of someone who has had very little of it and has learned to recognize its genuine form. Ethan, she said, his name again straight and unadorned in her voice. Yes, thank you, she said. Just that, not elaborated, not decorated. Said the way she said the things that actually mattered plainly with her eyes steady on his face. Don't thank me yet, he said. Blackwood's not done. Neither am I, she said. Outside, the Montana afternoon was going gold around the edges of the world. The kind of afternoon light that makes the land look like it's worth every hard thing anyone ever did to keep it. Inside, Abigail Miller opened her ledger and went back to work, and Ethan Carter went to write a letter to his lawyer. And somewhere in Harlan Creek, Harold Blackwood was in his office, deciding that he had not yet heard the last word on the matter. He was right about that, but not in the way he was expecting. Harlan Dowes arrived at Carter Ridge on a Friday morning, and he was exactly the kind of lawyer that made opposing counsel nervous, not because he was loud or aggressive, but because he was the kind of man who read everything twice and forgot nothing. He was 54 years old, thin as a fence rail, with wire-rimmed glasses, and the patient eyes of someone who had seen every variety of human dishonesty and had long since stopped being surprised by any of it. He sat across from Abby in the front room with a notepad and a pen and asked her to tell him everything. Not a summary. Everything. Abby told him everything. She was precise. She gave dates, times, exact words she remembered being spoken. She described the evening at the dinner table without embellishment and without minimizing. She described her refusal and the response to it. She described riding out that night. She spoke without visible emotion and with the kind of organized clarity that made Dows's pen move quickly and his eyebrows raise once slightly, which for Harlan Dowse was the equivalent of a standing ovation. When she finished, he reviewed his notes for a moment. "Miss Miller," he said, "you are aware that Blackwood is claiming the conversation at your family's dinner table constituted a binding verbal agreement on your behalf." "I'm aware of what he's claiming," she said. "I'm also aware that I never agreed to anything. I was informed of an arrangement that had already been decided. I refused it. I said the words out loud at the table in front of my father, my stepmother, and my 2 sisters. And Mr. Carter was also present." "In the kitchen adjacent," Ethan said from his chair near the window. "The walls are thin. I heard the full exchange." Dowse made a note. "I'll need a signed statement from both of you. What Blackwood is attempting has no legal basis whatsoever. You cannot enforce a marriage contract on behalf of a party who explicitly refused consent, full stop. But he does have some influence with Judge Carver on the circuit, and influence has a way of stretching legal definitions when it's allowed to." He looked at them over his glasses. "What I'd like to do is file a formal declaration with the county records establishing Miss Miller's independent legal standing and her documented refusal before Blackwood can get anything in front of Carver. Move fast, move first. Put it on paper before he can muddy the water." "How fast?" Ethan asked. "Monday." "Do it," Abby said before Ethan could speak. Dowse looked at her. Then he wrote something down. "One more question, Miss Miller. Do you have any concern that members of your family might contradict your account?" Abby was quiet for just a moment. One moment precise, and contained the kind that only someone paying close attention would notice. "My father," she said, "is a man who does what he's told by whoever is standing closest to him and speaking loudest. My stepmother will say whatever protects the family's financial position." She paused. "My sisters didn't speak that evening at all." "So the family will most likely corroborate Blackwood's version." "Most likely," she said. "Yes." Dowse nodded slowly. He did not offer false comfort. He said, "Then the speed matters more than I initially indicated. We file Monday, and we make it public county record open to any journalist who asks." He looked at Ethan. "You mentioned the Helena paper." "Their editor owes me a conversation," Ethan said. "Have that conversation before Monday," Dowse said. He closed his notepad. "Gentlemen, ma'am." He stood and shook their hands with the efficiency of a man who had 3 other matters to attend to before sundown. After he left, the room was quiet. "Monday," Abby said. 3 days. Ethan confirmed. She nodded once. Then she went back to her office and he heard within 2 minutes the sound of the supply ledger opening. He stood at the window for a moment and thought about Harold Blackwood sitting in his office in Harlan Creek, confident and patient, in the way that men with money and connections tend to be confident and patient, and he felt something cold and very clear settle in his chest. He picked up his hat and went to write the letter to the Helena Courier. The letter to the Courier was 1-page factual and signed with his full name. He described the arrangement Blackwood had proposed to Jacob Miller. He described the terms debt cancellation in exchange for Abigail Miller's consent to marry consent which had never been given. He described the legal action Blackwood was now attempting. He made no accusations he couldn't support. He made no appeals to emotion because the facts were emotional enough without help. He gave the letter to his fastest rider and told him to be in Helena by nightfall. On Saturday morning he had a reply from the editor, Thomas Graves, who was not a man who minced words. "This will run Tuesday, unless you tell me otherwise. Do you want me to hold?" Ethan wrote back 2 words. "Don't hold." That same Saturday, Abby came to find him in the barn, where he was working through a problem with one of the mares. She stood at the stall rail with her arms crossed and a look on her face that said she'd been thinking hard about something. "Blackwood's going to come here," she said. "He's not going to send another letter. He's going to come in person." Ethan looked at her. "What makes you say that?" "Because he's that kind of man," she said. "I've watched men like him my whole life. The ones who think property and money make them right. They don't stay behind letters when letters don't work. They come themselves because they think the physical presence of them is enough to settle an argument." She paused. "My father is the same way underneath the worry. He'll come with Blackwood. He'll think that seeing him, seeing his own face, will make me reconsider." "And will it?" She gave him a look that answered that comprehensively without requiring words. "I'm telling you," she said, "because when it happens, I want you to let me handle it." He was quiet for a moment. "Abby, I mean it, Ethan. I know you want to. I know your first instinct is to stand between me and whatever's coming. I understand that, and that's not a criticism of you." She looked at him steadily. "But if I let you fight this for me, it will be your victory. And I need it to be mine." He held her gaze. He wanted to say several things. He said the right one instead. "All right," he said. "I'll be in the room, but it's yours." She nodded. Something in her face eased by the smallest degree. "He'll come Tuesday or Wednesday," she said, "after he's seen the paper." She was right. He came Wednesday. The sound of wagon wheels on the main road reached Ethan in his study at 10:30 on a Wednesday morning, and he was at the window before he'd consciously decided to move. 2 horses, 1 wagon. Jacob Miller on the seat, older looking than Ethan remembered from 17 days of observing him at his own ranch. Or perhaps it was just that Ethan was seeing him differently now, with the knowledge of what he'd agreed to do with his daughter sitting between observation and judgment. Beside him, Harold Blackwood, and in the wagon bed which Ethan had not anticipated, Margaret. He found Cal in the corridor. "They're here," he said. Cal looked past him toward the front of the house. "All of them. The stepmother, too." Cal's jaw tightened very slightly. "Where's Abby?" "Supply room. She heard the wagon." He paused. "She asked me to let her lead." Cal looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a man evaluating a decision he's not sure he would have made himself. Then he nodded once. "All right. Then you stay a step behind and keep your mouth shut unless she needs you." "That's the plan." "It's a good plan," Cal said. "Let's see if you can actually do it." Abby came out of the supply room with the account book still in her hand, which was either accidental or deliberate. Ethan suspected deliberate, and she met them in the front room where Rosa had already, with the quiet efficiency that was Rosa's primary language, arranged chairs and produced coffee that no one was going to drink. Jacob Miller walked into the room first. He looked at his daughter, and for a moment something moved through his face that might, in a better man, in a different moment, have been the beginning of an apology. But Margaret came in directly behind him, and whatever that moment might have become, it didn't become it. Harold Blackwood came in last. He was a large man, broader than Ethan had fully appreciated from a distance, the kind of large that had started as strength and had been softened over the years by money and comfort into something that still occupied space aggressively without necessarily being able to back it up. He wore a good coat. He had the particular confidence of a man who has never seriously been told no by anyone whose opinion he respected. He looked at Abby the way he might look at a piece of property that had been temporarily mislaid. "Abigail," Margaret said. Her voice was the efficient voice, the voice of practical matters to be settled. "I'm glad you're well." "Are you?" Abby said. She kept her voice pleasant, not warm. Pleasant the way you keep a door pleasant before you decide whether to open it. "Your father and I have been very worried. I read your letter," Abby said. "You were worried about Mr. Blackwood's proposal. That's what the letter said." She looked at her father. "Papa, are you all right?" Jacob Miller had the decency to look uncomfortable. "I'm fine, Abby. We've just..." He stopped. Tried again. "This has been a difficult few weeks. For all of us," Margaret said briskly, moving the conversation along before Jacob's discomfort could go anywhere useful. "Mr. Blackwood has been very patient, Abigail. He's traveled all this way because he wants to speak with you directly. He feels, and I think reasonably, that you left under emotional circumstances and perhaps didn't fully consider—" "I considered it completely," Abby said. Blackwood, who had been standing to the side during this exchange with the patience of a man saving his real intervention for the right moment, stepped forward now. "Miss Miller," he said. His voice was the kind of voice that expected to settle things. "I think you may have some misapprehensions about what I'm offering you. I'm a man of means. You'd be well provided for. The house in Harlan Creek is comfortable. You'd want for nothing. Nothing except the choice of whether to be there," Abby said. A silence. Blackwood's expression shifted slightly. Not anger, yet recalibration. "I understand you feel the arrangement was presented abruptly. I'm prepared to allow more time." "Mr. Blackwood," Abby said, and her voice stayed even, but something in it changed. Register moved from pleasant to clear in the way that a sky moves before weather arrives. "I refused this arrangement at my family's dinner table 3 weeks ago. I said the word no. I said it out loud, in front of witnesses." She paused. "I have since provided a signed legal statement to that effect, which is filed with the county records. My attorney has also provided documentation of your subsequent attempts to seek legal remedy for an agreement that was never made." She looked at him steadily. "Is there something about the word no that you need me to clarify?" The room was very quiet. Ethan was standing 2 steps inside the doorway. He kept absolutely still. Blackwood's face had gone through several things in the last 10 seconds. He landed on something that was trying to be dismissive and not quite getting there. "You've been given some very bad advice by whoever has been filling your head with legal language, Miss Miller. This situation is resolved," Abby said. "On my end, completely." "Abigail." Jacob Miller's voice had the quality of a man who's waited too long to speak and now doesn't know quite what to say. "Abigail, I need you to understand the position we're in. The debts are the ranch's." "I know the debts, Papa," she said. And for the first time her voice changed, not soft exactly, but something closer to the center of her. "I have known the debts for 3 years. I am the one who has been managing the accounts, who knows exactly what you owe and where and when it's due. I know the position you're in." She paused. "What I won't do is let you make it my position by giving me to someone I didn't choose." "Nobody's giving—" Margaret started. "That's what it is," Abby said. Quiet, entirely clear. "That is exactly what it is, and I think on some level you know it. And I would like you to stop pretending otherwise, because we're past the point where pretending is a kindness to anyone." Margaret's face did several things. She landed on something that looked like she'd been slapped and was deciding how to respond to it. Jacob Miller sat down heavily in the nearest chair and put his face in his hands. It was Blackwood who recovered first. Because Blackwood was the kind of man who had a contingency for most things, and his contingency for a woman who refused to be managed was to escalate. "I'll be direct with you, Carter," he said, turning to face Ethan for the first time, pivoting from Abby, with the deliberate motion of a man choosing a different target. "You've been harboring this woman and putting ideas in her head about legal rights and attorneys, and I don't know what else. I don't know what your interest in this situation is." "My interest?" Ethan said he had kept his mouth shut as planned, but this was directed at him, and he was not going to let it stand unanswered. "Is that a woman who works for me was being coerced into an arrangement she refused. That's the complete extent of it." "Works for you," Blackwood repeated with a particular inflection that managed to imply an entire range of things without technically saying any of them. "As my ranch operations manager," Ethan said, keeping his voice entirely level. A position she was offered based on her qualifications and has been filling with notable competence since she arrived. If you'd like references, I'll give you Cal Briggs's name and Hector's name and the name of every hand on this property who has worked alongside her. Blackwood looked at him. The assessment in his look was not of the fast kind. It was the slow, calculating look of a man who is running numbers and not liking the sum. "There's a story running in the Helena Courier today," Ethan said, "about the nature of the arrangement you proposed to the Miller family, the terms, the circumstances of Miss Miller's refusal, the subsequent legal pressure." He paused for exactly one beat. "I thought you should know that if you didn't already." Blackwood went very still. "The Helena paper," he said carefully. "Thomas Graves, he's a thorough journalist. The story is factual. Every detail is documented." The room was the kind of quiet that has weight to it. "You did this," Blackwood said. Low. The voice of a man who is no longer performing patience. "Miss Miller's attorney filed the legal documentation," Ethan said. "I provided the newspaper with a factual account of what I witnessed. Both of those things were done openly and under my real name. I'm happy to discuss either one in more detail if you'd like." Blackwood's face had gone the particular color that comes when anger and embarrassment arrive at exactly the same moment. He looked at Abby. He looked at Ethan. He looked at Jacob Miller, who had lifted his face from his hands and was now looking at the floor with the expression of a man who has realized he is in a room where things are beyond his ability to manage. "This isn't finished," Blackwood said. But it had the sound of a man saying words because retreating without saying words would feel worse, not because the words meant something. "Yes?" Abby said. "It is." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked out of the room. The silence after the door closed held for about 4 seconds. Then Margaret stood up. "Abigail, do you understand what you've done? Do you have any idea?" "I do," Abby said. "I understand exactly what I've done. You've made an enemy of the most powerful banker in this county. You've humiliated your father. You've thrown away the only offer." Margaret's voice cracked just slightly on the last word, and Abby saw it and didn't look away from it. "It wasn't an offer, Margaret," she said. "It was a transaction. There's a difference." She paused. "And I'm not the one who humiliated my father. The decision you two made 3 weeks ago took care of that." Jacob Miller made a sound. Not a word. Just a sound low and painful. "Papa," Abby said. And her voice changed completely. Not soft, something more complex than soft. The voice of someone who has loved a person and been hurt by them and is holding both of those things at the same time. "Look at me." He looked up. His eyes were wet. "I love you," she said. "I have spent my entire life trying to make your life easier because I love you. I have cooked and cleaned and managed accounts and kept that ranch alive on my own for 3 years because I love you." She stopped. "But what you agreed to that night was wrong. You know it was wrong. And I can love you and still refuse to let it happen." His face crumpled. "Abby, the debts can be managed," she said. "Not the way Blackwood proposed, but there are options. I've been in the accounts long enough to know there are options. If you want my help with that actual help, real help from someone who knows the numbers, you can write me, and we'll have that conversation." She looked at her stepmother, who was very still. "But not like this. Not under these conditions. Never again like this." Margaret opened her mouth. Then she closed it, which for Margaret was something close to a surrender. Jacob Miller wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He looked at his daughter. Really looked the way a man looks when the pretense has burned off, and what's left is the plain truth of what he's done and who he's looking at. "I'm sorry," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't, Abby. I didn't think—" "I know, Papa," she said. "That's most of the problem, isn't it?" He flinched. She didn't take it back. But she also reached forward just briefly and touched his hand, one quick, honest press of her fingers over his. The kind of touch that says, "I'm not gone without saying I forgive you," because forgiveness wasn't the right word yet, and she wasn't going to offer a word that wasn't right just because the moment seemed to ask for it. They left an hour later. Blackwood had not come back into the house. He'd waited at the wagon with the particular rigidity of a man holding himself together through pride, which is the least reliable structural material in the world. Abby stood at the front of the house and watched them go. Ethan stood near the doorway. He waited. When the wagon was gone from sight, she turned around. Her face was composed, which he'd expected. What he hadn't expected was the color in her cheeks, not quite upset, not quite relieved. Something that was in between those things and slightly above both of them. "You all right?" he asked. She stopped. "Yes, I think so. I don't feel what I thought I'd feel." "What did you think you'd feel?" "I don't know. Victorious, maybe, or sad." She seemed to be processing it in real time. "I just feel clear. Like when a fever breaks and you can't quite believe the heat is gone." He nodded slowly. "That's not a bad way to feel." "He's going to try something else," she said. "Blackwood. He doesn't stop." "No," Ethan said. "He doesn't." "So what happens now?" He looked at her. "The paper runs. The county records stand. Dow's is good at his job. And Blackwood is going to discover that trying to coerce a woman publicly is a significantly worse position than he's used to being in." He paused. "It won't be immediate. He'll push a few more directions first." "I can handle that," she said. "I know you can. She stopped again. Something was working through her, something she was trying to find the language for. She looked at him direct and a little unguarded in a way she rarely allowed herself. "I've never stood in a room and said what I meant and had it be enough. Just the words. Just what I actually thought. Without someone talking past me or over me or making me feel like my opinion was a minor inconvenience." She shook her head slightly. "It feels strange. The way it feels when something you've wanted so long finally happens, and your body doesn't know how to process the absence of the wanting." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "It's going to feel normal soon," he said. "You're going to say what you mean, and it's going to be enough, and eventually you're not going to remember that it used to be otherwise." She looked at him for a long moment. "You sound certain of that." "I'm certain of the people on this property," he said. "The rest follows." Something in her expression did the thing it sometimes did, that quiet shift barely visible that he'd learned to look for because it was the truest indication of what she was actually feeling beneath the composure. She looked down at the account book still in her hand. Then she looked back up. "I'm going to finish the quarterly projections," she said. "I want to have them ready for you by Friday." "That's 3 days ahead of when I asked." "I know." And the corner of her mouth moved. "I work fast." She went back inside, and he stood at the front of his house for a moment, looking at the empty road, and feeling the particular satisfaction of a Wednesday that had gone the way Wednesdays very rarely go, the way where the right thing happened, and the people who deserved to lose were losing, and the person who had been told her whole life that she wasn't worth defending had just stood in a room and defended herself without asking anyone for permission. The Helena Courier hit Harlan Creek on Thursday. Ethan knew it had hit because Cal came to find him before breakfast with the expression he used for significant developments. Not alarmed, because Cal was rarely alarmed, but attentive in a way that communicated the information required his direct attention. 3 riders from town in the last hour, Cal said. 2 of them are men I recognize from the county offices. The third one was wearing Blackwood's company colors. What did they want to? They didn't stop. They rode past the gate and kept going. He paused. One of them slowed down long enough to look at the main house. Ethan set down his coffee. Where's Abby? East Paddock. She's been out there since sunup. He found her working alongside Hector with the composure she maintained. Everywhere she went, her coat against the morning cold, her attention on what her hands were doing. She glanced up when she heard him, and he could tell by the look on her face that she'd already heard something. One of the hands told me about the riders, she said before he could speak. They didn't stop, he said. They were looking. She straightened. Blackwood's reading the story right now and deciding his next move. He's going to be angry. The anger is going to override his judgment for about 2 days. After that, she thought, After that, he's either going to accept it's over, or he's going to try something that's harder to defend against. What do you mean by harder to defend against? She looked at him. He can't touch me legally. Dow's made sure of that. He can't force me back. My father won't come again. I saw it in his face yesterday. He's done. She paused. What he can do is hit where he thinks you're vulnerable. Your business, your accounts, your relationships in the county. He's a banker. He knows who you borrow from and when and for what. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then, my accounts are solid. I don't borrow significantly, and what I do borrow is diversified enough that one bank can't apply meaningful pressure. You've thought about this. Since the night Whitfield told me Blackwood had influence with Carver. He looked at her steadily. I've been running a business for 15 years, Abby. I know how men like Blackwood operate. I've already moved 2 accounts to Helena that were in county banks within his reach. She stared at him. When did you do that? The week after you arrived. You did that before. She stopped. You did that before he even came here, before you knew what he was going to try. I knew what he was going to try, he said simply. Men like him are predictable. They don't accept loss. They redirect it. Something moved through her face that was complex enough to take a moment to read. You were protecting the ranch, she said carefully. I was protecting you, he said. The ranch is fine either way. The morning was very quiet around them. Hector had found somewhere else to be, which Ethan suspected was less accidental than it appeared. Abby looked at him for a long moment. The way she looked at things, she was thinking seriously about. Not guarded, just careful in the way she was careful with things that mattered to her. Ethan, she said. Yes. I want to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. Always, he said. She took a breath. Do you do any of this, the accounts, the lawyer, the newspaper, because you feel responsible for me, because you brought me here, and now you feel like that means you owe me something? He looked at her. He'd known this question was coming, or something like it. He'd had 17 days at the Miller Ranch and 3 weeks at his own property to understand how Abby Miller processed things, and one of the truest things about her was that she could not tolerate ambiguity when it touched her own worth. She needed to know where the ground actually was. No, he said. Not responsibility, not obligation. He paused. Chose the next words with the care they deserved. I do it because I have met very few people in my life whose company makes me feel like myself rather than a version of myself I'm performing for someone else. And you are one of those people. And I find that I am not interested in watching someone try to take that away from you or from me. She was very still. He kept going because he'd started, and stopping would be a worse kind of dishonesty than saying it plain. I know what we agreed about the professional arrangement. I know what the terms were, and I intend to honor them completely. That's not what I'm not asking anything from you. I'm just telling you the truth of what this is for me, because you asked me to be honest, and I'm not able to give you anything less than that. The morning moved around them. A horse shifted somewhere, wind in the grass. That's the most words I've heard you use at one time since you told me who you really were, she said finally. It takes that many sometimes. She looked at him for one more long moment. Then she looked down at her hands. Then she looked back up, and the thing he saw in her face in that moment was something he had not seen there before, not in 17 days at the Miller Ranch, and not in 3 weeks at his own. Something that was tentative and real in equal measure, the way something is real when it's new, and the person holding it isn't sure yet what to do with it. All right, she said quietly. Just that. All right, he said. I believe you, she said. That's what all right means. He nodded. He didn't push it further. He had learned with Abby Miller that the most important thing was to give her the space to arrive at things herself, because the things she arrived at herself were the ones that stayed. Blackwood's next move came on a Saturday, and it didn't come from Blackwood directly, which was how Ethan knew he'd calculated it. It came from 3 men he'd never met before, who rode up to the property and asked to speak with the person in charge of the range cattle contracts for the upcoming season. Ethan met them in the yard. Two of them were from a cattlemen's association in Billings. The third was a man named Foster, who represented a beef processing company whose contracts with Carter Ridge were significant. Foster did most of the talking, and he talked the way a man talks when he's been given a script and is hoping the other person won't notice. "There's been some discussion," Foster said carefully, "in the association about the situation here. At Carter Ridge." He cleared his throat. "Some concern about whether certain associations might affect the reputation of the operation in terms of future business arrangements." Ethan looked at him. "Foster, I've done business with your company for 9 years. In that time, have I ever given you cause to doubt my integrity?" "No," Foster said. "Honestly, no, you haven't." "Then let me be equally direct with you. A woman works for me. She is my operations manager. She came here from a situation in which she was being coerced into a marriage she refused. The man doing the coercing is Harold Blackwood, who I assume reached out to some of the association members within the last 48 hours. Foster's expression confirmed it without him saying a word. "Harold Blackwood," Ethan said, "is a banker in Harlan Creek who has 2 overextended loans, currently drawing scrutiny at the Territorial Banking Commission." The Helena Courier ran a factual story about his conduct toward Miss Miller 2 days ago, and it is drawing significant commentary from people in this territory who have complicated feelings about Harold Blackwood anyway. He let that sit for a moment. "I'd encourage you to think carefully about whether being associated with his position on this matter is something that benefits your company. Because my reputation in this territory is 38 years of clean dealing. His is something considerably less clean." Foster looked at the other 2 men. The other 2 men looked at their boots. "I don't think there's actually a problem here," Foster said after a pause. "I think there may have been a miscommunication about the nature of, 'I think we're fine, Ethan.'" "I think so too," Ethan said. "Tell whoever sent you that I said so." He shook their hands, and they rode back down the road, and he stood watching them go, with the cold clarity of a man who has just confirmed that the war is not over, but that the first battle went as expected. He went inside and found Abby in her office. "Blackwood just tried to pressure my beef contracts," he said from the doorway. She didn't look up from the ledger. "I know. Rosa told me 3 men rode up." Then she did look up. "How bad?" "Not bad at all. Foster's not Blackwood's man. He was uncomfortable about being there." He paused. "But it tells us something." "It tells us he's scared," she said. "It tells us he's willing to go wide," Ethan said. "Which means he knows the direct approach failed." She set the pen down. She looked at him with the focused expression she used when she was thinking through a problem practically. What else can he reach? "The county water rights renewal is in 8 weeks, Ethan said. "He has some relationship with 2 of the 3 commissioners reviewing it. That's the next likely pressure point. What do we need for that? The renewals are straightforward. My usage is well within the documented limits. But Blackwood could introduce complications, challenge the survey, raise questions about the eastern boundary." He paused. "It would delay things, cost time and money, create uncertainty. But not succeed," she said. "Not with Dows on it. No." She was quiet for a moment. "He's going to run out of pressure points," she said, "sooner than he thinks, because every move he makes from a position of anger is a move that costs him something and gains him nothing." "That's what I think too." "So we stay steady," she said. "We don't react. We let him keep spending himself." He looked at her across the small office at this woman who 3 weeks ago had been sitting at a family dinner table being sold, and was now calmly mapping the strategic position of a man who was trying to ruin her life with the composure of a general who knows the terrain better than her opponent. "When I hired you as operations manager," he said, "I may have undersold the title, Daddy White." Something in her face did the thing, the quiet shift, the almost smile. "You haven't seen me operate yet," she said. "Give it time." Outside, the Montana afternoon was doing something beautiful with the light, the way it sometimes did when everything was difficult and going to be difficult for a while longer yet, and the world went beautiful anyway in the spaces between. Inside, Abby picked up her pen and went back to the ledger, and Ethan went back to his study, and Harold Blackwood sat somewhere in Harlan Creek, reading the Courier and planning his next move. He had 3 more moves left. He didn't know yet that she had already anticipated every one. Blackwood's water rights challenge arrived exactly when Ethan said it would. 8 days after the failed cattle contract pressure, Dow's sent a rider to Carter Ridge with a document that was 14 pages long, dense with legal language, and essentially amounted to Harold Blackwood disputing the eastern boundary survey of Carter Ridge's water access rights, a survey that had been filed, confirmed, and uncontested for 11 years. Ethan read it at his desk. He read it twice. Then he carried it to Abby's office and set it on her desk. She read it once. "He filed this himself," she said. "Look at the signature line. His personal attorney, not the bank's. He's spending his own money on this." "I noticed that." "That means the bank's board doesn't know he's doing it, or they know and they're not backing it, which means they think it's a losing proposition." She set the document down. "Either way, he's isolated." Ethan looked at her. "That's the same conclusion Dow's reached." He used the word overextended. "He's angry enough to be making bad decisions," she said. "Angry men who make bad decisions keep making worse ones if you don't give them a clean exit." She paused. "Is there a clean exit you'd be willing to give him?" He thought about it seriously, because she'd asked seriously. "If he withdraws the water challenge and formally abandons any claim against you, I'll agree not to pursue him for the harassment costs Dow's has been accumulating." "That's reasonable," she said. "Do you think he'd take it?" 2 weeks ago, no. Right now, maybe. He's been in the paper. He spent money on 2 failed maneuvers, and Foster went back to Billings and told the association that the Carter side of this story is considerably more solid than the Blackwood side. He's losing ground, and he knows it. He looked at her. "Do you want to offer it?" She was quiet for a moment. "I want to be in the room when it's offered," she said. "Done," he said without hesitation. She looked at him with a slight assessing look. "You agreed to that fast." "Because it's your right to be there," he said. "There's nothing to think about." Something moved through her face. Not surprise exactly, but something in the neighborhood of it, the particular look of a person who has been underestimated so many times and so thoroughly that being taken as a matter of course still registers as something worth noting. She looked back at the document. "Have Dow's draft the terms. I want to review them before they go." "I'll tell him today." She nodded and picked up her pen, which was he'd come to understand her way of saying the conversation was productive and complete, and that she intended to process the rest of it in the reliable privacy of her own thoughts. He took the document and left her to it. 3 days later, Dow's came back to Carter Ridge with a counterproposal from Blackwood's attorney that was essentially a rejection dressed in formal language. Dow's summarized it at the kitchen table with the brisk economy of a man who had been reading legal obfuscation for 30 years and had long since lost patience with it. "He's not taking the exit," Dow's said. "His attorney is claiming the boundary dispute is a legitimate legal question independent of any personal matters, which is their way of saying they want to keep the water rights fight alive without it looking like it's connected to his conduct toward Miss Miller." "Separating the threads," Abby said. "Trying to," Dow's said. "It won't work. The timing makes them inseparable in any reasonable reading. But it does mean we're going to hearing which will be in front of Commissioner Aldrich in 3 weeks. He looked at Ethan. "Aldrich is not Blackwood's man. He's nobody's man, which in county politics is a fairly rare commodity. The survey evidence is clean and the case is straightforward. We should prevail." "Should," Abby said. "In law, that's the best word available," Dow said. She absorbed this. "What do we need to prepare?" "The original survey documents which you have. The maintenance records for the eastern water access, which Cal tells me are complete back to 1874, and a clean account of the timeline when Blackwood first contacted the Miller family when Miss Miller refused when you arrived at Carter Ridge and the subsequent sequence of his actions." He looked at her steadily. "You may be asked to testify at the hearing, Miss Miller. It's not a court proceeding, but it's formal, and Blackwood's attorney will be there. I understand, she said. He will likely try to discredit you, Dowse said with the directness of a man who considered false comfort a form of malpractice. His strategy will be to suggest that your account of events is colored by an interested relationship with Mr. Carter. The room was briefly very still. Let him try, Abby said. Her voice was steady and entirely without drama. My account of events is documented. My refusal is on county record. Every communication Blackwood has sent since I arrived here is in a file in my office. If his attorney would like to characterize that as an interested account, they're welcome to attempt it. She paused. I've been being characterized my whole life. It stopped working on me a while ago. Dowse looked at her for a moment. Good, he said simply, and wrote something in his notes that he didn't explain. Moned. The shift at Carter Ridge happened so gradually that Ethan almost missed it happening, which was perhaps the most honest indication of how real it was. It wasn't one event. It was the accumulation of small things that don't announce themselves. It was Rosa stopping by Abby's office, not just with work matters, but with coffee and conversation, the two of them falling into an easy rhythm of talking that had nothing to do with supply orders. It was Hector who expressed approval through the precise calibration of how much he criticized. He had almost entirely stopped criticizing Abby, which in Hector's vocabulary was the equivalent of a standing ovation. It was the two children of the seasonal workers, Elena and Tomas, who had established Abby as a fixed point in their daily orbit with the unerring instinct children have for identifying which adults are genuinely safe. It was the hands who no longer watched her with the polite, careful uncertainty of people trying to figure out what she was and whether she'd be staying. They'd figured it out. She was staying. She belonged here. It had taken approximately 11 days for the people of Carter Ridge Ranch to arrive at a conclusion that the people of Harlan Creek had never managed. Ethan noticed all of it. He noticed it the way you notice something that's changing the temperature of a room, not dramatically, but completely. He also noticed what was happening to her. It wasn't a transformation in the way stories sometimes describe transformations all at once and obvious. It was quieter than that. It was the way she stood up a little straighter by the third week. Not because anyone had told her to, but because nobody was telling her to make herself smaller. It was the way she started offering opinions without preemptively apologizing for having them. It was the day he heard her laugh, a real laugh, full and unguarded, at something Cal had said in the yard, and the sound of it caught him somewhere in the chest and stayed there. She was discovering slowly, and with the caution of someone who has been hurt by good things before, that good things here were allowed to be good. It was on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after she'd arrived, that everything almost came undone. He came inside from a late walk of the property to find Rosa in the main corridor with an expression he'd never seen on her face before. Rosa was a woman of considerable composure, and the expression she was wearing now was several things he couldn't immediately read. She had a visitor today, Rosa said, while you were in the Northfield. He stopped. Who? Her sister, Cecilia. He'd met Cecilia once briefly in the Miller household, 17, pretty self-absorbed in the uncomplicated way of a girl who has never had to work for the attention she receives. He'd formed no strong opinion of her except that she moved through a room as though its furniture had been arranged for her convenience. Where is Abby now? He said. Her room. She hasn't come to dinner. Hasn't. He found Cal first briefly to get the shape of it. Cal had been in the yard when Cecilia arrived and had heard the beginning of the conversation before Abby closed the door. What did she want? Ethan asked. Cal's expression was very controlled. From what I could tell, she came to tell Abby that your name is all over the county now, and that people are saying things about why Abby's here and what the arrangement is. He paused. She also told Abby that Papa Miller had a collapse 2 days ago. Heart. He's alive, but... Ethan was already walking toward the south corridor. He knocked on her door, quiet for a moment. Then, come in. She was sitting in the chair by the window, not looking out of it. Her hands were in her lap. She looked up when he came in, and he saw immediately that she'd been crying not recently, but in the last few hours, and she'd put it away. and what was left was the particular stillness of someone who has gotten through something and is now taking stock of what's on the other side. "You heard," she said. "Cal told me the outline." He came and sat across from her without asking. "Tell me the rest." She told him. She told him about Cecilia, who had come not out of concern, but out of a kind of anxious social vanity, the worry that her older sister's notoriety was reflecting on the family in uncomfortable ways, that people in town were talking, that the story in the Helena paper had Cecilia's name adjacent to things Cecilia didn't want her name adjacent to. She'd told Abby, with the particular tactlessness of a girl who has never learned to consider the weight of her words, that most of the county had an opinion about why a woman like Abby was living at a ranch with a man like Ethan Carter, and it wasn't a flattering one. She didn't mean to be cruel, Abby said. She said it without defensiveness, just as a plain observation. That's the worst part. She genuinely doesn't understand that she was. What did you say to her? I told her to go home. Abby looked at her hands. And then she told me about Papa. How bad? The doctor says it was mild, but he's been ordered to rest. The ranch work can't continue at the pace it has. She paused. He needs help. Real help. The accounts are... She stopped. I know those accounts, Ethan. I built those accounts. And they're going to fall apart without someone managing them who actually knows what they're looking at. He was quiet for a moment. What are you thinking about doing? She looked up. Her eyes were clear, which cost her something. I'm not going back, she said. I want you to understand that. Whatever I figure out about my father's situation, I'm not going back to what I left. I know, but I can't. She stopped, started again. He's my father. Whatever he did, he's my father, and he's sick, and he doesn't have anyone who understands those numbers. She looked at him with the direct, uncomplicated honesty that was the most fundamental thing about her. I don't know what the right answer is. I came here thinking I was done, and now I don't know what done means anymore. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, What if done means something different than you thought? She waited. What if done doesn't mean closing the door entirely, he said. What if it means you decide the terms? You help your father with the accounts from here remotely on paper at a distance that you control. He gets the benefit of your knowledge. You don't go back to being someone's solution. He paused. You define what help looks like. Not your stepmother, not Blackwood, not the county. You. She was very still. I've never been allowed to do that, she said quietly. I know, he said. That's why it's worth trying. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked down at her hands again, and he could see her turning it over the same way she turned everything over, carefully and completely, not rushing toward a conclusion she couldn't fully believe in. Would it bother you, she said, if I were still involved with the Miller Ranch's finances in some way? No, he said, immediately, without qualification. She looked up. It won't be simple. My stepmother will try to make it complicated. Your stepmother, he said, has been trying to make things complicated for you your entire life. I don't think that's a reason to leave your father without help. No, she said. Neither do I. She took a breath, the kind that signals the end of one thing and the beginning of another. All right, I'll write him tomorrow. Do you want to tell me what to say? Something moved through her face, quietly. No, she said. I know what to say. Then after a moment, thank you for not telling me what to do. You haven't needed me to tell you what to do since approximately day 2, he said, that almost smile. The corner of her mouth very slight. Day 1, she said. I had it figured out by the end of day 1. I just needed to confirm you weren't going to get in the way. He stood up. Dinner's been waiting. Rosa is maintaining polite neutrality about it, which means she's been politely furious for about an hour. She stood too, smoothed her dress, composed herself in the way she did not hiding just gathering. He'd come to understand the difference. "Ethan," she said, as he turned for the door. He stopped. "What Cecilia said, about what the county thinks." She paused. "Does it trouble you? What people are saying about why I'm here?" He turned around fully. He looked at her and thought about the careful answer, the diplomatic answer, the answer that would be easiest to hear. He said the true one instead. "The only thing that would trouble me," he said, "is if I'd done something that earned it. I haven't. You haven't. So no, it doesn't trouble me." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once and walked past him toward the kitchen, and he followed, and Rosa received them both with the particular warmth of a woman who had already decided which side she was on and was glad to see her choice confirmed. The water rights hearing was on a Thursday morning, and every person at Carter Ridge Ranch knew it was happening, which meant the property operated that day with the particular focused quiet of people who are not talking about something because they are thinking about it too hard to talk. Abby rode to the county offices with Ethan and Dowse in Ethan's best wagon, which she had not asked him to use, but which he had prepared anyway. She wore her best dress. She hadn't brought many things from the Miller Ranch, but she'd bought 3 things in Helena the week prior with the first installment of her salary, and she wore the most serious one. She sat straight. She looked at the road ahead. She did not fidget. Dowse reviewed the key points of the case for the 3rd time. Ethan listened. Abby said at the end of it, "Harlan, I have read the survey documentation 4 times. I can cite the boundary markers by number. I'm prepared." Dowse looked at her over his glasses. "I know you are," he said. "I'm reviewing it for my own comfort." She accepted this without comment, which Ethan thought was generous. The hearing room held about 30 people when it was full. It was close to full. That was the first thing Ethan noticed. The second thing he noticed was that most of the people in it were not parties to the legal matter. They were county people, ranchers and merchants, and 2 women who ran a laundry service, and a man he recognized from the feed store, all of them present with the particular quality of attendance that says, "This matters, and we want to see how it goes." The Helena Courier had done its work. Blackwood was already there at a table on the far side of the room with his attorney and a younger man carrying documents. He did not look at Abby when she came in. He looked at the table in front of him with the composure of a man maintaining something through will. Commissioner Aldrich was 60 years old, gray-haired, with the deliberate movements of a man who had presided over enough county business to know that speed and accuracy were not always compatible, and who had long since chosen accuracy. He called the proceedings to order without ceremony and stated the matter plainly: a boundary dispute over the eastern water access rights of Carter Ridge Ranch, filed by Harold Blackwood as an independent party. Dowse presented the survey documents. He presented the 11 years of uncontested filing. He presented the maintenance records. He presented the timeline, not the personal timeline, not the Abby and Blackwood timeline, just the property timeline with the clean precision of someone who has organized his case for a man who values clarity. Blackwood's attorney raised the challenge. It was a technical argument, not a strong one, but a technical one, the kind that creates friction and requires answer. He suggested the original survey had an error in its northeastern notation that, if corrected, would shift the water access boundary by approximately 40 feet. 40 feet that would not coincidentally cut Carter Ridge's access to the creek by a third. Dowse responded with the county surveyor's original field notes, which had never been entered into evidence before, because they had never needed to be. The field notes confirmed the boundary precisely as filed. The northeastern notation Blackwood's attorney was challenging was a standard notational convention that the county had been using since 1869. Aldrich asked Blackwood's attorney 3 questions. Short, direct questions, the kind that Aldrich asked when he'd already understood something and wanted it on record. The attorney answered all 3 poorly, which was not his fault. There were no good answers available. Then Aldrich said, "Is Miss Abigail Miller present?" "She is," Dowse said. "I'd like to hear from her." Abby stood. She walked to the front of the room with the composure she walked everywhere. Not stiff, not performed, just the natural carriage of a woman who has been carrying herself without help for a very long time and has gotten good at it. She stood at the front of the room and looked at Commissioner Aldrich and not at Harold Blackwood, and not at the 30 people watching her. Aldrich said, "Miss Miller, you were employed at the Miller family ranch in Harlan Creek until approximately 6 weeks ago." "I was," she said. "And you are currently employed as operations manager at Carter Ridge Ranch under Mr. Carter." "I am." "Are you aware of Mr. Blackwood's claim regarding the water boundary?" "I am. I've reviewed the survey documentation and the field notes." She paused. "The boundary as filed is correct. The northeastern notation Mr. Blackwood's attorney is questioning is a standard convention. I can cite the County Surveyor's Handbook, 1871 edition, Chapter 4, which defines that notation explicitly if that would assist the commission." Aldrich looked at her over his own papers. "You've read the Surveyor's Handbook." "I read things that are relevant to the cases I'm involved in," she said. Aldrich's expression didn't change, but something in it settled. He looked back at his notes. He asked her 2 more questions, both of which she answered with the same plain, documented precision, and then he said, "Thank you, Miss Miller," and she returned to her seat. Blackwood's attorney requested the opportunity to question her. Aldrich granted it. The attorney stood. He was younger than Blackwood by about 20 years and had the slightly uncomfortable bearing of a man doing a job he's not entirely comfortable with, but has been paid to do. He looked at his notes. "Miss Miller," he said, "you've been living at Carter Ridge Ranch for approximately 6 weeks." "Correct." "And in that time, you've become closely involved in the management of the ranch." "As the operations manager, yes. You'd describe your relationship with Mr. Carter as professional." "I would." "Some might describe it as something more." He said it carefully, not quite an accusation, just leaving it in the room. Abby looked at him. "Some might describe the sun as cold," she said. "That wouldn't make them right." She paused. "If you have a legal question relevant to the water boundary, I'm happy to answer it. If you'd like to speculate about my personal life, I'd suggest the county hearing room is probably not the right venue for that." A sound moved through the room. Not quite laughter. Something more like 30 people simultaneously deciding something. The attorney looked at his notes again. He asked 2 more questions, both of which she answered with documented facts, and then sat down. Aldrich reviewed his materials for a moment. The room was very quiet. "The boundary as filed is correct," Aldrich said. "The challenge is not supported by the evidence presented. Motion denied." He looked at Blackwood's table with the expression of a man who has something additional to say. "Mr. Blackwood, this commission has now reviewed 2 filings in recent weeks that bear a significant relationship to a personal dispute that is a matter of public record. I'd encourage you to consider before filing any further legal challenges whether the purpose of the county commission's resources is best served by the uses to which you've been putting them." He set his papers down. "We're adjourned." Chapter Key. The room emptied with the particular energy of people who have witnessed something and need to talk about it among themselves. Ethan and Abby came out of the hearing room into the corridor, and for a moment they were simply standing there. Dow's had been waylaid by someone who wanted to discuss another matter, and people were moving around them, and the day outside was bright and cold, and everything that had needed to happen today had happened. Abby let out a breath. Just one, slow and controlled. "You were extraordinary in there," Ethan said. "The County Surveyor's Handbook, 1871 edition," she said. Chapter 4. "I wasn't certain I'd need it, but it seemed like the kind of thing that might be useful." She looked at him, and in her eyes he could see the particular brightness of a woman who has just won something she deserved to win and is letting herself feel it instead of immediately moving to the next problem. "It's over, isn't it? The water challenge, it's done." "It's done," he said. She nodded. She breathed. "And the rest of it, the harassment costs?" Dow's said. "Dow's will send Blackwood's attorney a letter this afternoon," Ethan said. Given that Aldrich just publicly suggested Blackwood reconsider his use of commission resources, I think the letter is going to land considerably better than it would have yesterday. He'll accept the settlement. I think so, yes. She was quiet for a moment. Around them, the corridor continued to empty people heading back to their days. several of them nodding at Abby with the specific respect of people who have watched someone conduct themselves well under pressure. A woman Ethan recognized as the wife of a local merchant, a woman who had been part of the Harlan Creek social fabric for 30 years, the kind of woman whose opinion circulated, stopped in front of Abby. "Miss Miller," she said. "I'm Martha Hendricks. You don't know me." "I know your name," Abby said carefully. "I've known Harold Blackwood for 20 years, Martha said. "I've watched him do 3 versions of what he tried to do to you to other people who didn't have the resources to push back." She looked at Abby directly. "I'm glad somebody finally did." She walked on. 2 of the women behind her offered brief nods that communicated the same thing. Abby watched them go. "In 6 weeks," she said quietly, mostly to herself. "I have had more people treat me like a person in this county than in 29 years in Harlan Creek." Ethan didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "What do you make of that?" She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about everything that mattered. "I think the world is bigger than the one I grew up in," she said, "and that I lost a lot of time not knowing that." He looked at her profile, clear and serious, and something else. Something he was finding it increasingly difficult to describe to himself with the clinical language of professional regard. He said, "You're 29, Abby." She turned to look at him. "You haven't lost time," he said. "You've been building. Every day at that ranch, everything you learned, everything you managed and carried and figured out without anyone helping you figure it out, that's not lost time. That's what made you the person who walked into that room today and cited Chapter 4. He paused. "That's what made you the person who 6 weeks ago threw a coat on and rode out in the dark rather than let someone else decide what her life was going to look like." She looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes had gone quiet in that way they went when something had reached her. Not touched her surface, but gone further than that. "You're doing it again," she said softly. "Doing what?" "Saying the thing that costs you something to say." He held her gaze. "It doesn't cost me anything," he said. "It's just true." She was quiet. Dowse appeared at the end of the corridor and started toward them with papers in hand and the purposeful stride of a man whose next item is already on the list. Abby straightened. She adjusted the collar of her coat. "I need to write my father today," she said. "I've been putting it off." "I know. And there's a feed cost discrepancy in the October records I haven't traced yet." "I know that too." She nodded. Then she said quietly, not looking at him now, but at the bright rectangle of the door at the end of the corridor. "Ethan, do you think a person who spent most of their life being told they weren't much, do you think they can actually change that? Not just on the outside, actually change it. Inside." He was quiet for long enough that she glanced at him. "I think," he said, "that you've been who you are your entire life. I don't think anything needs to change. I think what needed to change was the room you were standing in." He paused. "And that part's already done." She held his gaze for one more moment. Just the 2 of them standing in a county corridor in Montana in 1887, with everything that had happened and everything that hadn't yet hanging gently in the space between them. Then Dowse arrived with his papers, and the next item on the list commenced, and Abby turned to Dowse with her full attention and her clear, sharp mind, and the same direct competence that she gave to everything she decided was worth giving it to. But she was standing a little differently. Not taller exactly. Not changed the way stories describe people changed. Just more settled. The way a person stands when they've finally found the ground that will hold them, and they know somewhere below conscious thought that they are not going to be moved. Blackwood's attorney sent a letter 7 days later. Ethan read it. He took it to Abby's office. He set it on her desk. She read it in about 45 seconds, which was how long it took to read a 1-page letter that used 100 words to say 3 things. The water challenge was formally withdrawn. The attorney's office was prepared to discuss settlement of the harassment costs, and Harold Blackwood had no further legal or personal claims to pursue in this matter. She set the letter down. She looked at her desk, at the organized stacks of paper and the supply ledger, and the annotated accounts, and the letter to her father that she'd finished on Wednesday and mailed on Thursday and hadn't yet heard back from. She picked up her pen. Then she set it back down and looked up at him, and on her face for the first time entirely unguarded, without the composure that was her armor and her habit, and the wall she'd built to survive a life that had required one, was something open and real and certain. Not happiness exactly, though it was in there. Something deeper than happiness. Something that had the quality of a woman who has been fighting for so long she'd forgotten what ground felt like, and has just set her feet on it. "We won," she said. "You won," he said. "Specifically." She held his gaze. "We," she said again. And this time, it wasn't a correction. It was a declaration. He looked at her. This woman, who 3 months ago had been the person everyone looked through. The burden no one claimed the daughter sold to solve a debt, and felt something he had no intention of saying out loud yet, because it was too large and too important, and she had too recently found solid ground, and he was not going to crowd her before she'd had time to stand on it properly. But he felt it. Completely. With the certainty of someone who spent 17 days watching a person be themselves under the worst conditions imaginable, and fell in love with exactly what they saw. "Now," she said, picking her pen back up, "the October feed discrepancy isn't going to solve itself." "No," he said. "It isn't." She was already looking at the ledger. He went back to his study, and Carter Ridge Ranch went about its afternoon. And somewhere in Harlan Creek. Harold Blackwood was a smaller man than he'd been at the beginning of the season, and Abigail Miller, who had once been the woman nobody chose, was running one of the finest ranches in Montana and had just beaten a banker in county court using a surveyor's handbook from 1871. She was only just getting started. Jacob Miller's letter arrived on a Monday morning, and Abby read it alone at the kitchen table before anyone else was up. She'd been awake since before dawn, a habit she'd carried from the Miller Ranch that Carter Ridge had done nothing to cure because there was always something that needed attention in the hour before the day officially started, and she'd long since made peace with the fact that she was a person who needed that hour to belong entirely to herself. She was on her second cup of coffee when Rosa came in and put the letter in front of her without comment, the way Rosa delivered most things with the quiet precision of a woman who understood that some moments needed space around them. She recognized her father's handwriting on the envelope. She sat with it for a moment before she opened it. He'd written 4 pages. Jacob Miller, who communicated primarily through gestures and silences, and the occasional short statement delivered to the middle distance rather than directly to anyone, had written 4 pages in a hand that was slightly uneven in the way of a man who has been ill and is still not fully steady. He told her he was improving. The doctor had restricted him to light work for 6 more weeks. The ranch was being managed by a hired hand named Gus, who was competent but unfamiliar with the particular logic of how things had been organized, and he said this with the careful understatement of a man who was beginning to understand that the logic of how things had been organized had been Abby's logic, and that without her, it was not especially obvious. He told her he'd read the Helena Courier. He told her he'd heard from 3 separate people about the county hearing. He said, and this was the part that made her stop and read the sentence twice, "I have not been a good father to you in the ways that matter most. I am not certain I know how to be, but I am trying to understand what that should have looked like, and the understanding is arriving later than it should have." He did not ask her to come back. He did not mention Harold Blackwood by name. He asked simply and without decoration whether she would be willing to continue the correspondence to help him understand the accounts to write when she was able to let him know she was all right. He signed it. "Your father who is sorry." She sat with the letter for a long time after she finished it. The kitchen was quiet around her. Through the window, the ranch was beginning its morning. She could hear the sounds of it starting up the particular rhythm of a property coming awake that she had memorized over weeks. The same way she'd memorized everything that mattered to her by paying sustained and serious attention to it. She folded the letter. She put it in the pocket of her apron. She got up and poured a 3rd cup of coffee and stood at the kitchen counter and let the feelings move through her in the order they arrived. The grief first, because there was grief in that letter. The grief of love that arrived too late and too poorly shaped to do what it should have done. And then something more complicated, something that wasn't forgiveness yet, but was in the same country as it. The country where you can hold the pain of what someone didn't do and the reality of who they are at the same time without either one canceling the other out. She wrote back that afternoon. 2 pages. She told him she was well. She told him about the hearing in practical terms without drama. She sent him a simplified version of the Miller Ranch account corrections she'd been working through in her mind since she left, laid out clearly enough that Gus could implement them with minimal confusion. And at the end, she wrote, "I am not ready to say everything is all right between us, but I am willing to keep writing. That is what I have right now, and I think it is worth something." She signed it Abby. She gave it to the Monday writer and went back to work. The first time Ethan almost said something he'd been carefully not saying was a Wednesday evening in December, 6 weeks after Blackwood's letter of withdrawal, when the temperature had dropped hard and the ranch had settled into the particular indoor closeness of a property in winter, where the days were shorter and the evenings longer, and people gathered by necessity as much as by choice. They'd been going over the quarterly accounts together. This had become a habit, not because he couldn't review them himself, but because reviewing them with her was faster and more accurate. And also, though he had not said this aloud to anyone, including himself, because he liked the particular quality of attention she brought to a problem, the way she moved through numbers, the way other people moved through familiar rooms with the confidence of long acquaintance. She caught an error in the timber supply projection that he'd been carrying forward for 2 quarters without noticing it, and she pointed it out, not with the satisfaction of someone who has found a mistake, but with the efficiency of someone who has found the solution and would like to move on. "How did you?" he started. "The lumber cost per unit went up in September, and the projection didn't update," she said. "It's been compounding forward. You've been underestimating your build costs by about 12%. For 2 quarters. Yes." He looked at the number. "That's not a small thing." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She made the correction in the ledger with the calm of a woman for whom accuracy was a moral position as much as a professional one. "Do you want me to adjust the spring projections as well while I'm in here?" "Please," he said. And then, because the evening was quiet and the fire was the primary light in the room, and 12% over 2 quarters was the kind of thing that reminded you what you were actually looking at, he said, "Abby." She glanced up. "I need to tell you something," he said. She set the pen down. She looked at him with the direct, unguarded attention she gave to things that mattered. "All right," she said. He'd thought about how to say this. He'd rehearsed several versions, discarded all of them, and was now sitting across from her with the full awareness that anything he'd prepared was going to sound like he'd prepared it, and that she would know, and that she would think less of it for that. So he said the plain thing. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been for some time. I don't know exactly when it started, probably somewhere around the day I watched you carry a bucket of water across a yard while 3 men laughed at you from the road, and you didn't give them the satisfaction of a single visible reaction. And I thought that was either the strongest thing I'd ever seen or the saddest, and then I realized it was both." He paused. "I'm telling you now because I said I would always be honest with you, and not telling you this is the same as lying." He kept his voice even. "I am not asking you anything. I'm not changing what's between us unless you want it changed. I'm just telling you what's true." The room was very quiet. She looked at him for a long time. Long enough that he had time to wonder if he'd misjudged if the ground he'd thought was solid was actually Ethan, she said. "Yes, I know," she said. He looked at her. "I've known for about 3 weeks," she said. "I've been trying to decide what to do with it." She looked down at the ledger, then back up at him, and on her face was the most unguarded thing he'd ever seen. There, more unguarded than the night in the barn, more than the corridor after the hearing, more than any of the moments he'd been collecting without quite calling them that. "The problem isn't what I feel. The problem is that I have spent my whole life having people tell me what my life should look like, And I needed to make sure that this was mine, that I was choosing it. Not because you were kind to me when no one else was not, because you gave me a safe place when I had nowhere to go. Not because I'm—" She stopped, started again more carefully. "I needed to make sure I wasn't choosing you, because you were the first person who was decent to me. Because that's not love. That's gratitude. And you deserve more than gratitude." He was very still. "And," he said, quietly. She looked at him with the eyes that saw everything clearly and never pretended otherwise. "And," she said, "it's not gratitude." The fire moved. The room was warm. Outside, the Montana winter was doing what Montana winters do, which is everything at once with great commitment. He didn't move toward her. He didn't reach for her hand or cross the room or do any of the things that the moment might have invited. He sat where he was and looked at her, and let it be what it was, large and quiet and entirely real, and said, "All right." "All right," she said. And they looked at each other across the account ledger in the firelit room, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the kind of moment that doesn't need anything added to it. After a moment, she picked up her pen. "I'm going to finish the spring projections," she said. "Good," he said. "I'll get more coffee." He got up and went to the kitchen and stood at the stove for a moment with his hands around the coffee pot, and something in his chest that had been wound tight for a very long time, coming loose all at once, quietly, the way things that have been held too long release when you finally set them down. The twist that nobody saw coming arrived in January, and it came from a direction no one had been watching. It came in the form of a letter from the Territorial Banking Commission in Helena, not addressed to Ethan, not to Dowse, but to Abby directly. She brought it to him without having opened it, which he recognized as a statement of trust that he did not take lightly. He opened it beside her. The commission had been conducting a review of Harold Blackwood's banking operations since November. The review had been triggered by the Helena Courier story, or more precisely, by the number of people the story had prompted to contact the commission with their own accounts of Blackwood's business practices. The letter informed Miss Abigail Miller that she was one of several individuals whose documented testimony was being reviewed as part of a formal investigation into Blackwood's practices regarding debt collection loan terms and coercion. It also informed her that Jacob Miller's outstanding debts to Blackwood's bank were among the accounts currently under review, as there was evidence that the loan terms had been set under conditions that may not have met the territorial standards for fair lending. Abby read it twice. Then she sat down very slowly in the nearest chair. "He didn't just do this to us," she said. Her voice was quiet with the particular quietness of a realization arriving. "He's been doing this for years, to other families, other people who couldn't push back." "Yes," Ethan said. "The Miller Ranch debt may be voided," he said carefully. "If the terms are found to be coercive, that's what they're investigating." She looked at the letter. She looked at it for a long time. "My father could keep his ranch," she said. "If the investigation finds what I think it's going to find, yes." Something moved through her face complex and layered the way feelings are complex and layered when they've been building for a long time under pressure. She pressed one hand flat on the table, steadying herself. "He never had to make that arrangement," she said. "With me, with Blackwood. None of it if someone had investigated 6 months earlier, none of it needed to happen." "No," he said. "It didn't. But if it hadn't happened," she said slowly, "I would still be there, at that ranch, carrying water and baking bread and making myself useful to people who couldn't see me." She looked up. I don't know how to feel about that." "You don't have to feel one way about it," he said. "It can be both things. Something terrible that shouldn't have happened and that brought you somewhere you're glad to be." He paused. "Both of those things can be true at the same time." She held his gaze. Then she looked back at the letter. "I need to tell my father," she said. "I know. And I need to write to Dowse. I'll send a rider to Helena this afternoon." She stood up. She straightened her shoulders with the particular motion he'd come to love the gathering the decision to proceed. "One more thing that Blackwood set in motion that's going to end somewhere he didn't intend," she said. "That's about right," he said. She took the letter and went to write to her father, and Ethan stood in the empty room for a moment, feeling the specific weight of a story that has more justice in it than you expected arriving in the form of a banking commission letter on a January morning in Montana. The investigation concluded in late February. Blackwood's banking license was suspended pending further review. 11 accounts, including the Miller family's primary debt, were flagged for remediation under the territory's fair lending statutes. Jacob Miller's outstanding balance was reduced by 60% and restructured at terms that for the first time in 3 years he could actually meet. Abby received the news by telegraph. She was in the east paddock working with Hector when the rider brought it out to her. She read it standing in the cold with her coat on, and her breath making small clouds in the February air. She handed it to Hector without comment. He read it. He handed it back. "Huh," he said, which for Hector was a full paragraph. She folded the telegram. She put it in her pocket next to the latest letter from her father. She went back to work for exactly 45 minutes, completing what she'd been doing with the same focused attention she gave everything. Then she went inside and found Ethan. She didn't say anything when she walked in. She handed him the telegram. He read it. He set it on his desk. She crossed the room and took his face in her hands and kissed him. It was not a tentative kiss. It was not a cautious asking kiss. It was the kiss of a woman who has made a decision with the full weight of her judgment and her heart and her considered understanding of her own life and has decided completely. It lasted long enough to say everything that words would have made smaller. When she pulled back, she looked at him with those clear, serious eyes. "I've been thinking about what you said in December," she said. "About not asking me anything." "I remember," he said. His voice was not entirely steady, which he considered reasonable under the circumstances. "I want you to ask me something," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The February light was coming through the window. Outside the ranch was going about its afternoon. Inside everything was very still and very clear. "Abigail Miller," he said. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, without hesitation, without qualification. The word came out of her like something that had been waiting in exactly that shape, for exactly the right moment, and the moment had arrived, and there it was. He reached up and covered her hands with his, still holding his face. "Abby," he said. "I know," she said. "Me too." They told Cal first, because Cal had earned it. He was in the barn when they found him, which was where Cal generally was when he wasn't needed somewhere else, and sometimes when he was. He looked at them when they came in. He looked at their faces. He looked back at the horse he was working with. "Well," he said to the horse, "it took long enough." "It took exactly the right amount of time," Abby said. Cal turned to look at her, and on his face, weathered and economy-minded and generally allergic to sentimentality, was something that had no other name except moved. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he didn't dare hope for and has just seen arrive. "Miss Miller," he said, "it is going to be a genuine pleasure to call you Mrs. Carter." "Cal," she said, "you have called me Abby for 3 months." "That was professional," he said. "This is personal." And he extended his hand to her, and she shook it, and something passed between them that was the particular warmth of two people who have worked hard together and respected each other for it, and are now standing on the other side of difficulty together and finding it a decent place to be. Rosa wept briefly and efficiently, and then brought out the good coffee and refused to hear anything about it not being an occasion. Hector said, "About time," which was from Hector a wedding speech. The children, Elena and Tomas, demanded to know if there would be cake, which Abby promised with the seriousness of a binding contract. The wedding was in April, when Montana decided to be generous with the weather, in the way it sometimes did after a hard winter, as though making up for something. It was not a large wedding. Abby had not wanted large, She had wanted real, which was, she told Ethan, a considerably more specific requirement. Dow's came from Helena. James Whitfield, the county commissioner, came and shook Abby's hand with the expression of a man who is glad to see how a story ends. Thomas Graves from the Courier sent a note that was warm and brief and would have made a decent headline if printed, which Ethan suspected was intentional. Jacob Miller came. He arrived the morning of the wedding on a horse that was not quite up to the journey, but had made it anyway, which was something like a metaphor for Jacob Miller himself. He looked older than 6 months should have made him. He also looked like a man who had spent 6 months thinking hard about things he hadn't thought about carefully enough before, and the thinking had done something to his face, made it more present somehow. More there. Abby was in the main house when someone told her he'd arrived. She stood still for a moment. Then she went out. They stood in the yard and looked at each other. "You came," she said. "You invited me," he said. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I wasn't sure you meant it." "I meant it, Papa." He looked at her. The searching, painful look of a man trying to say something he doesn't have good words for. "You look—" He stopped. "You look like yourself," he said finally. "I don't think I've seen you look like yourself in a long time. Maybe not ever." Something moved through her face. She covered it quickly, not hiding, just managing. "I feel like myself," she said, for the first time. He nodded. His jaw worked for a moment. "I am sorry, Abby. What I agreed to. What we—" He stopped. "I know sorry doesn't fix it." "No," she said. "It doesn't." She looked at him steadily. "But I'm glad you said it. And I'm glad you're here." She paused. "That's where I am right now, Papa. It's not everything, but it's real. And I think we can build from real." He swallowed hard, nodded, looked at the ranch around them, the organized, thriving, well-managed ranch that his daughter had helped build over 6 months, and nodded again. "He's a good man?" he asked. "Carter." "He's a very good man," she said. "He's not perfect, but he's honest and he's kind, and he asks me what I think before he makes decisions that affect me." She looked at her father directly. "Those things matter more than I knew to ask for when I was younger." Jacob Miller closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they were wet. "I should have—" "Yes," she said simply. "You should have. But we're here now. That's what matters today." She hugged him. Not long, Abby was not a long hug person, never had been, but real and complete. And he held on for a moment, with the desperation of a man who knows he's being given something he didn't earn and is determined not to waste it. Margaret had not come. They had not discussed it. Abby had sent one invitation addressed to the household and Jacob had come, and Margaret hadn't, and that was the accounting of it, and it was enough information about the state of things. Cecilia had sent a gift, a small, somewhat impersonal gift, the kind you send when you feel you should but don't know the person well enough to do better. And a note that was 3 lines long and carefully warm in the way of someone practicing warmth rather than feeling it. Abby had written back with the same careful warmth and put both things away. That relationship was what it was. She had stopped expecting it to be something else. Josephine had sent nothing which was honest in its own way. Ethan came to find her an hour before the ceremony, which Rosa had specified as a violation of some tradition or other and had expressed this opinion to everyone within earshot, and which Ethan had declined to care about. He found her in her office. Of course, he found her in her office. She was reviewing a supply order, which was, and he was not surprised, an entirely Abby thing to do 1 hour before getting married. "Rosa's going to have opinions about this," he said from the doorway. "Rosa has opinions about everything," she said without looking up. "It's one of her best qualities." "Are you all right?" She finished the line she was on. Then she set the pen down and looked at him. She was wearing the dress she'd chosen for today. Not white. She'd been clear about not wanting white. She'd chosen a deep blue that made her look exactly like herself, and she had her hair pinned in a way that was practical and also unexpectedly lovely, which was the most Abby way to wear one's hair that he could imagine. "I'm completely all right," she said. "I was going to finish this order because if I don't, The spring feed delivery will be wrong, and then we'll spend 2 weeks correcting it. You can finish it tomorrow. I'm almost done. He looked at her. Are you finishing the supply order because it needs to be done, or because you're nervous? A pause. Both, she said. The supply order still needs to be done. Fair, he said. He came into the room and sat across from her. What are you nervous about? She looked at her hands. Not about you, she said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not nervous about us. She thought for a moment. I'm nervous about I've spent so long not being the person things happened to in a good way. The person things happened to was always me in a different sense. And today is a good thing, a very large good thing, and some part of me is waiting for it to turn out to be something other than what it looks like. She looked up at him. That's the part that's nervous, the part that hasn't quite learned yet that good things are allowed to stay. He looked at her for a long moment. They are, he said. Allowed to stay. This one especially. I know, she said. I'm working on believing it. You have time, he said. We have time, as much as we need. She held his gaze. Then she looked down at the supply order. She wrote 2 more lines. She closed the ledger. All right, she said. I'm ready. Ta. The ceremony was simple and clear, because those were the only kind of promises either of them knew how to make. The minister who came from Helena Dow's had arranged it because the Harlan Creek minister was too closely associated with too many complications, read the words that have been read for centuries and still mean something, when the 2 people saying them actually mean them. When he asked Ethan if he took Abigail Miller as his wife, Ethan said yes in a voice that left no room for interpretation. When he asked Abby if she took Ethan Carter as her husband, she said yes, the way she said everything that actually mattered plainly directly with her eyes, steady and clear, and entirely certain. Cal stood at Ethan's side. Rosa stood at Abby's. Jacob Miller sat in the front row with his hat in his hands and his eyes very bright, and at the moment, Ethan kissed his bride. Jacob Miller let out a breath that sounded like 3 years of the wrong kind of pressure, finally leaving a body that had been carrying it too long. Ethan kissed her with the same care he gave to everything he valued completely, and without hurry, and with the full and honest weight of what he felt. She kissed him back the same way. When they broke apart, Cal said quietly enough that only they could hear. Took long enough. You've used that line, Abby said. It applies twice, Cal said. The years that followed were not without difficulty because nothing worth having ever is. There were hard winters and lean seasons and disputes with neighboring ranchers over water tables and grazing boundaries, all of which Abby handled with the organized ferocity of someone who had read the county surveyor's handbook and was not afraid to say so in a public forum. There were letters from Harlan Creek that were sometimes warm and sometimes complicated, and a slow, imperfect rebuilding of something with Jacob Miller that never became what it might have been, and became something real anyway. There was the morning 14 months after the wedding, when Abby sat across from Ethan at the kitchen table before the ranch was awake, and told him with her hands around her coffee cup and her eyes steady on his face, that they were going to need a room they hadn't needed before. And the look on his face when he understood what she meant was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen on any person in her life, and she kept it like a coal kept in the pocket for warmth. There were 2 children eventually, a girl first, then a boy. Both of them raised on a ranch that valued work and honesty, and the particular kind of kindness that doesn't ask for anything back, because those were the values of the people who ran it, baked into the walls and the routines and the way adults on the property spoke to each other and to the hands and to the travelers who stopped at Carter Ridge looking for a meal or a night's shelter and left with both. Carter Ridge became known for that, for opening its door, for the woman who ran its operations with a mind like a steel trap and a policy of giving work to people who needed it and feeding people who were hungry and asking nothing in return for either. There were seasonal hands who came back year after year not only for the fair wage, But because Abby Miller Carter had a way of seeing people, the real people, underneath whatever the world had decided to think about them, that made a man feel like the person he was on his best day. Ethan watched her do it and never stopped being astonished by it. There was a day 5 years after they married when a woman came to the ranch door young, heavy with the particular way of holding herself that Ethan recognized instantly. The compressed posture of a person who has learned to take up as little space as possible, because the world has made it clear that space is not for her. She was looking for work. She'd heard Carter Ridge hired people who other places didn't. Abby answered the door herself. She looked at this young woman for a moment, at the held-in shoulders and the eyes that went sideways, rather than direct the whole familiar language of a person who has been told too many times that they are not quite enough. "Come in," Abby said. "Have you eaten?" The young woman said she hadn't, and Abby sat her at the kitchen table and put food in front of her and asked her name and what she could do in that order, because the food was more urgent than the inventory. She listened to the answers with the focused attention she gave to things that mattered, and at the end of it, she offered the young woman a position in the house staff with a fair wage and room and board. And the young woman's face did something at that moment that Abby recognized from the inside. She recognized the particular expression of someone who has been told their whole life they are too much or not enough, and has just encountered for the first time a door that opened instead of closed. Ethan was in the doorway. He'd come in from outside and stopped watching without announcing himself. Later that evening, after the young woman was settled and the house was quiet, he found Abby in the kitchen, and she was washing cups with the brisk efficiency of someone who is doing a small task because her hands need to be doing something while her mind sits with something larger. "You saw yourself," he said. Not a question. She was quiet for a moment. "A version of it," she said. "What did it feel like?" She thought about it. Honestly, the way she did everything. "Like finding out the door is real," she said. "Like knowing for certain that it actually opens, because you've been through it yourself." He came to stand beside her at the counter. Not touching, just near. The way they often were close enough that the nearness was a fact, not a statement. "You know," he said, "when Cal asked me what I was doing, leaving Carter Ridge to play drifter through 3 counties in a canvas work coat, I told him I was looking for something genuine." "And," she said. "I found it," he said. "In the first place, I stopped long enough to look." She set down the cup she'd been washing. She turned to face him. This man who had shown up at her gate as nobody and turned out to be everything, and she looked at him with those clear, certain entirely serious eyes. "Ethan," she said. "Yes." "You know what the county thinks now, when people talk about Carter Ridge? Tell me." "They say it's the ranch run by the woman who beat Harold Blackwood in county court with a surveyor's handbook," she said. "And that her husband had the good sense to let her." He laughed. The real laugh, the full one. The one she'd first heard from him in the dark on the ride north, and had been collecting ever since. "Is that what they say?" "That's what they say." And the corner of her mouth moved, and then the whole mouth moved, and Abigail Miller Carter, who had once been the woman no one chose, who had once carried water across a yard while the world looked through her, smiled the smile of a woman who is entirely and completely and irreversibly home. The woman everyone rejected became the woman most deeply loved, and she knew it. And she never once took it for granted, and that more than anything was the whole of the story.